Welcome everyone. This video is an in-depth 100% playthrough commentary on Metroid Prime for the GameCube. The version I'll be playing was recorded on the Dolphin emulator, mostly because it is the only method I have of capturing footage at the moment, but I do own a copy of Prime both on the GameCube and its remaster on the Switch. Before we begin, let me just tell you about the sponsor for this video, Tyrant's Twilight. It's actually not a sponsor at all, it's just my game I've been developing for a while. If you like what I do here, consider adding it to your wishlist on Steam using the link below, it would really help out. Thanks, and back to Metroid Prime. Right off the bat, the game makes a very strong first impression in its main menu. The camera swings around what seems to be a living organism filtered through a red-tinted visor. The music makes excellent use of distorted noises and the theremin to evoke a feeling of an alien dark mystery lying under the surface. Absolutely perfect for the adventure about to take place. The melody seems to expand on the melody of the original Metroid theme, and it's always nice when a composer can pick up the themes from an established series and make them feel fresh and not derivative. Metroid Prime's OST is a triumph in that regard. For the purposes of this commentary, I'll be playing with the hint system turned off, because it lets the level design shine brighter when it works, but also makes it more evident when it breaks down. I think it's important to note, Metroid Prime and Metroid Fusion, which were released on the same day, were only the 4th and 5th games in the series. The first two Metroids didn't even have a map system, which was only introduced in the 3rd game, Super Metroid. Given that both Prime and Fusion have a hint system, it could be that adding this feature was the developer's way of iterating on the quality of life brought to the previous game by having a map. I think nowadays it's easier to see this system as a bit of a misguided attempt. Getting lost in the world is a big part of the fun of Metroidvanias, but as long as it's optional, it's hard to complain. This is an advantage Prime has over Fusion. That being said, I would have preferred it if it was turned off by default. The game starts proper with Samus arriving at a derelict space station named Orpheon in response to a distress signal. The cutscene that introduces our main character must have felt like a triumphant return for fans of the series. It was easily the most impressive looking game on the system at the time it came out. After 8 long years, Samus was back in style. I was only 7 at the time and had never heard of Metroid until Prime, but I hear this return was not just cause for celebration but also dread. Because with the jump to 3D, Retro Studios decided to adopt a first-person perspective. I can imagine being apprehensive if I was a fan at the time, but I think right off the bat the game uses its tutorial to illustrate what makes it different from a regular first-person shooter. The first things the game teaches are not how to use the morph ball like the first game was famous for. It's how to lock on to targets and how to scan the environment. These two mechanics are what keeps the Metroidvania spirit alive in Prime, despite its shift in perspective. We'll talk about it more as the playthrough goes on, but for now, it's important to note that the lock-on de-emphasizes aiming, making combat less of a primary focus, while the scan re-emphasizes exploration as a means of gathering information. It doesn't seem like a happy accident that these are the first two things we do in the game. As soon as we enter the ship, we have the first overt reminder of our point of view from inside Samus's helmet. A loose pipe is leaking gas which blurs her visor with vapor. This puts the HUD into focus, and players might notice at this point that we are seeing gameplay critical information contextualized diegetically in the game's world as the visor in Samus's suit. There are an assortment of visual effects that remind us of this throughout the game, such as raindrops dripping on the visor, reflections of Samus's face, and electrical surges that scramble the image with noise. Little things like these can go a long way towards crafting a sense of reality for the game. Even this next corridor would be completely ordinary if not by the addition of a single scanner panel. Suddenly, this place is contextualized as a decompression chamber at the outer space entrance of the ship. It just makes sense for it to be here, whereas otherwise it wouldn't be any different than the previous corridor we just went through. Atmosphere is a big factor in Metroid Prime, and this tutorial section is dripping with it. The spaceship has a threatening soundscape of otherworldly sounds in the distance. There are parasites roaming the crevices, and it's not long before we begin seeing dead space pirates litter the halls, at which point the suspenseful atmospheric soundtrack kicks in. This room with the dead parasite wing has quite a few scannable elements, and it's one of the best examples of the game's environmental storytelling in action. Here we can learn about the parasites and their biology, we can infer their containment breach was the reason for the distress signal. All space pirate corpses have their own cause of death, but we know not all of them died since escape pods have been deployed 6 hours before our arrival. This room is also our first glimpse of Phazon, but we don't know the extent of its significance quite yet. The charge beam is used to clear some rubble on the way. It works as it did in Super Metroid, but it has an added functionality of attracting health and missile pickups towards Samus. This is mostly a quality of life feature that probably comes from the game's 3D nature, making it harder for Samus to reach certain places where enemies can be killed in. Especially with the absence of a lot of mobility power-ups from Super, like the Speed Booster, Screw Attack, and Infinite Jumps. I want to take a second to note the pause menu in which we can check out all the powers Samus has available in her arsenal. Each one has a short description accompanied by Samus's note on the ability. This is honestly a massive wasted opportunity to inject some personality into her. Her notes are always just a continuation of the description, incredibly dry stuff. I guess it paints her as a pragmatic type, which is fine, but we know she has a softer side too. This would be a good place to let that shine through with minimal changes to the game. The next corridor presents us with a short cutscene of parasites going through a small tunnel. If you're a fan of the series, here's where you would try hitting buttons to activate the morph ball. It's funny that the game doesn't teach us about this mechanic at this point, after clearly calling attention to its main application with the cutscene, but it does end up serving as a nice moment of discovery if you're curious enough to explore and unaware of the existence of the morph ball. The way the game seamlessly transitions from third to first person is an impressive feature, but I'll have more to say about it when we reach some longer morph ball sections. Right now, what matters is that this tunnel leads us to a map room, which functions the same as it did on Super. Orange rooms have been previously visited, while blue ones haven't. The colors might be different, but it functions the same way. The way the map is displayed as a simplified 3D rendition of the world really helps in identifying rooms based on their shape alone. I don't believe it's an easy implementation, but it's a map system so good I'm surprised I haven't seen it used in any other 3D games. I'm sure I must be missing some examples though. The map room also has some scans that say 2 pirate queens have become volatile in deck beta. We just saw a dead one in deck alpha, so we know a second one must be somewhere. This room is also the first time the name Tallon IV is mentioned as a source of radiation. On the next corridor, we get a proper morph ball tutorial, which might be placed here right after the cutscene with the parasites on the tunnel to teach players that you'll be going back to past locations with new abilities. I'm not sure how many players did that, but it's the only reason I can think of for the game to delay the tutorial up to this point. We reach a deck where one parasite queen is still in hibernation, but upon closer inspection, 2 other tanks are broken. That lines up with the scan we read earlier. There are 2 enemies here suffering from quote-unquote internal injuries and a pair of broken legs respectively, and their fighting styles reflect that. The first one has its hands pressed against its abdomen, while the second one is lying on the floor, unable to move. This is something this tutorial segment does wonderfully. All pirates have been injured to some capacity, and their injuries are reflected on their combat behavior. My favorite one has to be the one suffering from a brain hemorrhage, and that affects his ability to aim properly. The later enemies of this section are a bit more in fighting shape, and all of their descriptions describe quote-unquote minor injuries, so they're more mobile than their friends. Again, it's these little details that make the world come to life. On the next corridor, a new enemy is introduced, the turrets. There's not much to them. They function like you would expect. They spot the player and shoot. Much like the pirates we've faced so far, its projectiles are actually dodgeable, which makes the combat in Prime closer to a strafe-based boomer shooter than a military shooter, for example. For that purpose, locking onto enemies is vital, since you can't strafe without a second analog stick. But we'll dive into controls and button mapping in a later section. This next room has a dead monster which, based on the panels below it, seem to indicate this was also a parasite queen that was infused with so much radiation that it mutated itself to death. It looks like a fleshy mess, and it characterizes the space pirates as a society of mad scientists conducting horrific experiments. They are exploring some sort of radioactive element to mutate creatures for military purposes. In the middle of these panels, one of them contains our first lore scan. These will be the primary way in which Metroid Prime delivers its narrative, but I'll discuss this more after we leave this tutorial area. This first scan is a pirate data log that tells us of the fall of Zebes, placing Prime after the events of the first game. The pirates describe Samus as the Hunter, and anytime she's mentioned, they always display fear and hatred towards her. If you're scanning everything, you can accidentally deactivate a turret in this room before it's triggered to attack you, which is a nice incentive to keep scanning everything. All over this realm there are enemies we'll meet throughout the game, and even one enemy from Zebes, but we don't get to see it unfortunately. On the way to the next room, we fight the pirate I mentioned earlier with a brain hemorrhage, and another that's in a more fit condition. After a diagonal elevator ride, we arrive at a door that needs a morph ball bomb to be opened. This mostly functions as a tutorial for this piece of Samus's arsenal, but I like how these massive doors are different from the others. It makes sense that you would have more robust locks to prevent people from entering a ship's reactor. On that note, the two turrets guarding the entrance also make a lot of sense. In a room to the side, we get our first save station. Prime makes a small change compared to Super, since save stations now also recover you to full health. I don't mind this change as it mostly just cuts down on grinding for health. I can't really see any arguments for the inclusion of that type of grind. On the next room, we have our first boss fight in the game, the Parasite Queen. It looks pretty intimidating, but its stationary nature makes it quite easy to dispatch. The circular arena, paired with the rotating force field, makes for a great environment to test out the game's sideways dash, an important maneuver for the projectile dodging combat in Prime, which I consistently fuck up on this footage for some reason. In Super Metroid, the only indication of how close you were to killing a boss was its coloring, but Prime makes the decision to take away the ambiguity in favor of a more obvious health meter. Personally, I think both approaches have their merits. Super's is more ambiguous and distressing, Prime's is more comfortable and accessible. This change could be because getting the enemy coloring to sufficiently stand out in a 3D environment with more realistic lighting would be too much of a challenge for not enough benefits. The music is a continuation of the motifs from the Desolate Space Frigate theme, but with the added urgency of its incessant rhythmic percussion. I especially like the occasional drum beat being replaced with this weird static. I think it fits the mutated radioactive nature of the monster we're fighting. When the Queen is defeated, it falls into the ship's reactor, triggering a good old escape sequence. Players are given 7 minutes to evacuate, which is plenty of time really, but there is a lot that happens in this time. We loop back to the beta deck, where space pirates are fending off against the third Parasite Queen that was in hibernation the first time we went through this room. Again, these details give the world a sense of continuity even when the player is not present. The path back to Samus's ship is blocked by debris, which forces us to step inside the Orpheon's ventilation systems, where we can confirm for ourselves an earlier scan that mentioned these spaces were infested with parasites. It may not look like much, but having these many individual entities moving at the same time was a pretty impressive display for 2002. It's easy enough to just tank their damage, so they are here mostly for visuals and story reasons. The vents also have different door types from the rest of the ship. I think this is a cool detail, having different doors for different functionality, which is something that unfortunately the rest of the game doesn't do. The doors the Chozo built on Tallon IV are the same ones the space pirates have on their ship. It's just a nitpick, but it's also something they sought to fix in Prime 3, so it feels appropriate to mention. Right after leaving the vents, Samus meets her arch-nemesis, Ridley. It's a little weird that this high-ranking space pirate hadn't already been evacuated as soon as the Parasite Queens attacked, but maybe it was still in the process of being rebuilt, who knows. One detail I only noticed on this most recent playthrough is the emphasis on Samus's eyes. She seems pissed, and it helps contextualize why she goes to Tallon IV after the ship is destroyed. This is something that was unfortunately lost in the remaster. Samus's visor is a bit too opaque to see her expression. The game decides to only now introduce us to the Grapple beam. It makes a surprisingly good and intuitive transition into the third dimension, as does the game's platforming as a whole, but we'll talk more about it later. The most interesting aspect of using the beam at this point is similar to making us use the morph ball bombs to open the reactor's doors. The game is putting Samus's arsenal on display right before it is about to pull a Symphony of the Night on us. For those who don't know, Castlevania Symphony of the Night starts with its protagonist fully powered up before he is stripped of it all and spends the rest of the game trying to get his powers back. That's exactly what's about to happen here. A blast of energy from the crumbling ship makes Samus's suit malfunction, stripping her of the morph ball bombs, the missile tanks, charge beam, grapple beam, and the various suit. The escape continues until Samus leaves the Orpheon, boards her own ship, and sets out after her nemesis. After losing track of Ridley, she lands on Tallon IV to look for him on foot. Tallon Overworld is an impressive location right off the bat. The landing site is the most spacious location we've seen so far, and it's full of vegetation drenched in rain that interacts with Samus's body and visor. The music starts with atmospheric swells until it slowly reveals itself to be a familiar tune, the Criteria theme from Super Metroid. Other than the Metroid theme on Samus's intro cutscene, this is the first remixed song since hitting start on the main menu. It signals that we are done with the linear tutorial section and the familiar Metroid experience is about to begin. Speaking of familiarity, this escape sequence and the arrival at Tallon Overworld should also already be familiar to anyone who's played Super Metroid in the past. In taking Metroid to the third dimension, Retro seems to have taken a somewhat tried-and-true method which Zelda took when it made its jump to 3D. Keep the structure of the previous 2D game. Ocarina of Time follows A Link to the Past as closely as Prime follows Super. I don't mean to say this was a lazy approach. There was enough risk with the perspective shift on top of the added dimension. In a way, you could say it was the smartest approach they could take, but it does make things a bit more predictable than they would be otherwise. I have conflicting thoughts on this, but we'll talk more about it at a later part of the video. Like the landing site in Super Metroid, the landing site here is one of the biggest areas we've seen so far, but we're not really free to just go anywhere yet. Exploring this room, we can find an unreachable missile tank and a couple of doors we can't jump to with our current reach. From here we can go a little bit off the beaten path to reach the impact crater. On the way, we face some cedars which lurk on the ceilings. They drop some health pellets, but we can't reach them. It's a good example of the importance of the tractor beam functionality of the charge beam. The cutscene that plays in the next room emphasizes that it's a massive rock floating above a hole. We don't know how or why yet, but it helps to solidify its importance in our minds for later. We can't go too far ahead because we're blocked by a metal door that doesn't respond to our power beam, but we can analyze this weird floating symbol for another pirate data entry. It mostly hints at the purpose of the temple head as a seal for some vague energy source. One name drop that's significant is the name Chozo. It is the first mention that the bird species inhabited Tallon IV. This log also serves to let us know that the pirates are stationed here. They weren't just in orbit. This is the way 99% of Metroid Prime's plot will be delivered from now on. Arriving at the planet is practically our last bit of traditional expository storytelling. I cannot praise this system enough. Using the scanner as a means of collecting story bits makes players engage with the plot the same way we engage with the gameplay, through exploration and gathering of collectibles. I think later games, particularly Echoes, would find a better balance between traditional narrative and this form of collectible narrative, while also expanding on the lore potential much further, but I find it hard not to commend a massive AAA game that takes such a hands-off approach to its story. This is the kind of thing that the Soul series would be praised for many years later. Going back through the intended path, we face off against one of the most common enemies for this early section of the game, the beetles. The space pirates we've fought so far were pretty handicapped, so I think it's fair to say that these are the most aggressive enemies we've seen so far that are not stationary. The beetle rushes towards the player, moves left, then right, screams, and then goes for an attack. There's ample time to dodge the attacks, but making it even easier, if you move back a little, the beetle will repeat this entire sequence. It means this enemy acts more as an illusion of threat than an actual threat. It's pretty easy to catch them in a loop. Its only potential strength is in numbers, but even then, these are some very basic introductory opponents. The game's attention to detail is on display even in this small corridor, as we can scan random vegetation in the environment to learn bits and pieces about the world. These mushrooms on the wall will be relevant way later in the game. In the Tallon Canyon, we have a few serious veteran enemies, Zoomers and Gamers. They mostly just follow a set path, acting more as platforming obstacles than combat encounters. This canyon does showcase the levels of verticality the game will play with in its level design, but for now the only path that won't lead us to a dead end is on the ground level, which leads us to an elevator. This is a returning element from other games that works as a transport from one zone to another. This time, we're going to the Chozo ruins. The contrast between this place and the lush vegetation of Tallon Overworld is immediately apparent. The ruins are arid and devoid of life, at least for the first few rooms. Even the music at this point is practically non-existent, just a few low-register hums and some random creeping noises that could be mistaken as diegetic sounds of bugs hiding in the stone crevices. It sets a desolate mood, and it will be a while before the main theme for this area actually kicks into gear. Right at the entrance, we are greeted with a glowing wall that can be scanned for Chozo lores, the Chozo equivalent of space pirate data. It's pretty interesting that we get to see antagonistic perspectives on the events of the game through the records of these two factions. This one talks about a spring on top of the Chozo ruins. The Chozo have visions of it being corrupted in the future. I think this is the first time the Chozo were shown to have these supernatural abilities. Prime essentially introduces some mild magic elements into the franchise, unless I'm missing some lore from the previous games. Arriving at the main plaza, there are 3 paths we can reach. The path to the shrine is blocked by a metal door. The one to the fountain leads to a corridor where roots obstruct the way, so all that's left is to follow to the nursery. While exploring this area, players will probably notice a missile expansion and an energy tank on ledges too high to reach. A good reminder that unobtainable power-ups will be scattered throughout your travels, and it's the player's job to take mental notes of where they are and circle back to get them when they have more abilities. On the way to the nursery, we see another swarm of small enemies, like the parasites on the Orpheum's ventilation shafts. These are called scarabs, and they function in basically the same way. The next corridor introduces the ions, which are basically just lasers. Like the zoomers and gamers, they function mostly as platforming obstacles. Arriving at the nursery, we are immediately faced with another Chozo lore. This one talks about how the Chozo in Tallon IV forsook technology in favor of living in harmony with nature. This text also claims the Chozo are quote-unquote departing the planet and leaving it in pristine conditions, which is very weird considering later notes about Phazon. Maybe this will make more sense with other notes, I thought to myself, but the reality is that this version of Metroid Prime has a bunch of inconsistencies in its lore. I know you're probably tired of hearing this, but I'll talk more about that a little later. The war wasps are introduced in this room as well. They are a common enemy in the Chozo ruins. They are about as aggressive as beetles, but being airborne, they have more reach. Though, like the beetles, they go down pretty fast, and their strength is mostly in their numbers. They spawn in waves from hives on the wall, which are indestructible at the moment. So, all of this makes them a step up from the beetles in terms of difficulty, despite their weaker appearance. Other interesting details of the nursery are the morph ball maze embedded on the walls, leading to a missile expansion, the tree being filled with poison as a foreshadow of the area's main obstacle, and the small mirror that lets you see Samus's reflection. It's a pointless little detail, but it's a shame that this was removed in the game's remaster. Before venturing further, there's a save station nearby. The positioning of these save stations will be a topic of greater discussion later on. The next room has sculptures the Chozo made in honor of the Tallon star. This seems to confirm the planet is named Tallon IV for being the fourth planet in the star's orbit. It makes sense that the Chozo here, who are so in tune with nature, would venerate the star that gives the planet life. From this perspective, it also makes sense these ornaments are placed here, near the nursery, where new life would be taken care of. The next room is the Ruin Gallery. Not much to do here yet, but scanning the irrigation pipes confirms they are feeding poisonous water, seemingly confirming the Chozo's predictions. Moving forward, the next two rooms are tilted, which is a visually interesting twist, adding to the ruined characteristic of the Chozo ruins, but other than that, not much to discuss. This corridor has some plasmites, and they work the same way they did in Super Metroid, except that the room doesn't go pitch black when they are killed, making the enemy a little less interesting overall. It's time for our first mini-boss, the Hive Mecha. It's basically a security system that sends ram war wasps to attack us. These wasps are said to be one of the few creatures in Tallon IV that have developed a true hive mind. I think this is a clever way to justify their more gamey, coordinated attack patterns. The arena is small, forcing players to stay in the middle while the wasps circle around looking for an opening. They make a little shriek before attacking, so we need to be quick to determine where the sound is coming from and kill them before they slam into us. In an interview, Clark Wen, the audio designer for the game, said one of his biggest inspirations for the sound of Prime was the helicopters from the opening of Apocalypse Now. He was surprised to find out that the sound was synthesized, but it seems he really appreciated the stylized aspect of it, so he decided that was the approach he would take with Prime. Now, I don't understand anything about sound design. Usually, if nothing sounds out of place, that's already a great achievement in my mind, and Prime definitely passes that test. The biggest praise I can give the game is that some of its sounds are actually stuck in my mind, particularly the thermal visor effect. I love the rhythmic nature of it. All of this is to say that the excellent sound design goes a long way to facilitating this process of identifying where the next enemy will attack from in this fight. The biggest danger here is that they might push Samus into the poisonous water, which can be pretty difficult to get out of without the gravity suit. The wasps come in 3 waves, getting progressively more challenging as you'd expect, but all in all, not a terribly difficult fight. Our reward for beating the Hive Mecha is getting our missile launcher back. Making Tallon IV be inhabited by the Chozo was a smart decision to justify why all our missing equipment is scattered around the planet, since Samus' suit is also of Chozo origin. The missile is a concussive weapon that allows us to blast the metal plates we've seen blocking many doors in our brief tour of Tallon IV. There was one on the impact crater, one at the top level of the Tallon Canyon, another one in the Chozo Ruins main plaza, one on the ruined gallery nearby, and now there's one right in front of us as well. The way back from where we came is too high up to jump to, so the game is forcing the player to understand that the missiles can open these kinds of doors. On the other side, we have an energy tank that expands our health pool and an immediate dead end, since we don't have the morph ball yet. Going back to the mini-boss arena, a block falls from the ceiling, allowing us to reach the tall ledge we came from. It's one of the more contrived moments of blocking players from leaving a room until they learn about their new item, but it plays out pretty seamlessly, so I'm willing to give it a pass. Making our way back to the main plaza is our first instance of backtracking and Prime. This small bit of the game is a microcosm of what backtracking done right looks like. You just acquired a new item, and now the way back is recontextualized by this new ability. In the ruined gallery, you can destroy a wasp hive using a missile, open a metal door to obtain the area map, and destroy a cracked wall to start expanding your arsenal with a missile expansion. The map upgrade reveals how well interconnected this section of the Chozo Ruins are. With very few dead ends, most rooms circle back to each other. Of course, we can't take advantage of this layout yet, given our reduced inventory, but these loops will make for much easier traversal in the late game. This door here takes a little while to open, and it's the first example on my footage of how Prime deals with its loading times. It's funny that people assume the doors are quote-unquote malfunctioning when the game doesn't actually state that they have any problems anywhere in its text. I say it's funny because I always felt the same way, but really this could be barely classified as hiding the loading times. Yet everyone always mentions the doors malfunctioning as if it was a diegetic event in the game's universe. I honestly can't really tell if it was an intentional part on the developers or just a happy accident, but not breaking from Samus' perspective was definitely intentional, and it definitely adds to the world. At this point, you might have also started to note how the way Prime loads its rooms informs the level design. Most rooms are either large areas with multiple exits or corridors connecting to larger areas. It's highly likely that they are using these corridors as another layer of masking loading times. A cool small detail here is the heat coming out from Samus' arm cannon after repeated fast shooting at the wasps. Not much to say, just another one of those details that helps sell the reality of the game. Back on the main plaza, we can open the way to the ruined shrine. I think this metal door is well positioned to guide players to go there next. But, just as an experiment, I want to go back to the Tallon Canyon where there's another metal door a player could be curious about. Following this path to its end, we'll reach an elevator to Magmoor Caverns, but we can't even leave the elevator room because of the heat. This would be a mostly pointless excursion if not for a missile expansion hidden below the elevator bridge. I think this is an effective way of making players understand that at this point in the game they should probably stay in the Chozo Ruins, but still throw them an early bonus item for their efforts. The other possible place we could go is the Impact Crater, which would grant us our first Chozo artifact. But I'm going to leave that to a later point in the game, where a first-time player would more realistically come back to the landing site. Back on the intended path, the shrine is where we regain the morph ball. But first we have to deal with a swarm of beetles and a plated beetle immediately after. The common beetles show up in greater numbers than ever and in a tighter space than ever. It's a decent escalation in challenge. The plated beetle afterwards behaves mostly in the same way as its weaker counterparts, but it hits harder and can only be damaged from behind. It means waiting for it to attack and counter-attacking quickly before it turns towards Samus again. It's our first mobile mini-boss, but it goes down pretty fast, especially if you time your missile blasts right. As I said earlier, our reward is the morph ball, which allows us to leave this arena by going below the ledge that's too high up to reach. It's an exact translation from the morph ball rooms in 2D Metroids, but this time in 3D. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. This item isn't the only upgrade we get here, because as soon as we grab it, the Chozo Ruins music finally kicks in. It maintains the atmospheric swells we've been hearing up until now, but the percussion alone gives it a lot more energy. After a while, some theremin starts playing, some hypnotizing melodies. The melody is sketchy but mysterious, and it's played sparsely enough to maintain the desolate feeling of the area. A few things are open to us right now. We could go back to the room behind the Mecha Hive Arena to check out that hole in the wall. We could go back to the gunship in Tallon IV to grab another missile expansion, or we could head to the ruined fountain, which is right nearby. As I've learned from my excursion back to Talon Canyon when I got the missile launcher, for now it's probably best to follow the most obvious path. At the fountain, we are once again in a darkly lit room with plasmides lighting up the place. This time around, killing them did prove to make the room a bit harder to navigate, so this is better than their previous appearance, which felt a little pointless. Above the poisonous fountain, there's another Chozo lore in which they prophesized Samus will save them from what they call the Great Poison. At this point, we don't have much reason to believe this poison they talk about isn't referring to the poisoned waters. It almost could be read as a small-scale objective for this specific area, to rid it of the poison that plagues the place. Of course, we'll soon find out they're not really talking just about their ruined home. There are two paths we can take from the ruined fountain, the meditation fountain or the arboretum. The first one leads to the magma pool, which is likely the first time players will encounter the heat environmental hazard. It's a dead end for now. On the way back through the meditation fountain, we can see a couple of monuments on the wall telling of Samus' prophecy. Following the Arboretum path, we'll meet a couple new platforming type enemies, the Shriekbats and the Reaper Vines. The Shriekbats usually come in groups of about 5 and force the player to stop on their tracks and frantically snipe them out, unless you are fine with tanking some damage, but they can push you off platforms when they are well positioned. The Reaper Vines are indestructible enemies that usually hover above small platforms. Their indestructible status serves to put a time pressure on platforming. Players need to shoot the enemy in its eyeball, jump onto the platform, and quickly jump out before it comes back out of its hideout. The Arboretum is a tall and beautiful structure, but before we comment on it, I'll quickly make my way to the next area using the door closest to the one we came from. After a short corridor with leaky pipes, blasting some vapor in our faces, we arrive at the Gathering Hall, where a save station and 2 other paths are available to us. This is the first time where you can choose whichever one of the 2 without stumbling upon a dead end. The game is slowly loosening its training wheels. Based on my experience so far, I choose the easiest path first. The watery hall access corridor has some more optional lore about the source of the foul water yearning for the sun and the great poison sitting at the core of the planet. This differentiates the great poison from the source of the poisonous water for I think the first time in the game, but on a first time playthrough it probably wouldn't make much sense. We can grab a missile expansion here by destroying a suspicious wall. It's curious that there wasn't a scan for it, but maybe I was just too close to see it, I don't know. The Watery Hall proper is the first time we'll get a power-up without having to fight a mini-boss. We will have to solve an environmental puzzle, however. Taking the upper path leads the player to a metal plate blocking the way. Upon scanning it, we learn that there are 4 rooms that also need to be scanned to open the way forward. And would you look at that, there's one right in front of us. This room is basically a tutorial for the rune hunting we'll have to do later on the Arboretum. To solve this one, all you need to do is go back through the lower level instead of the upper one. With that, you'll stumble upon all 4 runes pretty easily. Before grabbing the power beam, I want to stop to talk about this Chozo lore above it. It basically tells us the origin of the Grey Poison was a meteor that struck Tallon IV. So far, so good. The problem I have with it is the whole part where it talks about the Chozo returning to Tallon IV because of the meteor. It didn't make any sense to me, so I found out that every version of Prime has a different version of the logs in the game. This is the NTSC version, but the PAL version is different. The Wii versions and the remaster are also different, but much closer to the PAL version. Turns out I wrongly assumed the NTSC version would be the closest to the developer's intent because they're all based in Texas. But it actually seems to be the one that makes the least amount of sense. The fact that they had a different version of the lore ready a mere 4 months later for the European release should have been a red flag, but it is what it is. Regardless, most of the basic backstory can still be extracted from these scans. We'll circle back to talk about the whole thing when we're closer to the game's conclusion. Picking up the charge beam activates a lot of ions, indicating that the new item can be used to dispatch them. There's a small hole in the wall here, but we can't access it because we don't have the morph ball bombs yet. It's okay because we're about to go grab them. The charge beam doesn't actually have any use towards exploration at this moment. As a matter of fact, it's practically optional until we acquire the super missiles later on. That being said, a quick look at the map will remind any player that might not know what to do next that there was another path available near the save station. Back in the Gathering Hall, we need to make our way up. I think this is a good time to talk about the game's platforming for a bit. This is definitely less true nowadays, but back when Prime came out, first-person platforming was kind of rightfully maligned by players. Some of the segments on the original Half-Life are a good example. Prime's slower movement speed, floaty jump arc, and forgiving platform placement and size make for a much easier time than any of its contemporaries in my opinion. Later on, we'll grab a double jump, which makes things even smoother. A subtle trick that designers employed was a slight tilt forward when jumping. It's a small thing, but it does help gauge distances and estimate where you land when you're in the air. Very impressive design if you ask me. Reaching the energy core, there's not much that can be done at this point, so we just keep going past this room into the burn dome where we'll fight another combination of Chozo machinery with killer wasps. This time it's the incinerator drone, a stationary machine that spins around itself, burning everything that comes across its 2 flamethrowers. This is an interesting fight as it's almost the inverse of the mecha hive. Instead of standing still at the center waiting for sound cues, this fight is all about mobility, moving away from the flames as well as the barbed war wasps that start pouring out of the hives in the ceiling. So far it's the most frantic encounter in the game if you ask me. Hitting the drone's weak spot 4 times finishes it off and grants us the morph ball bombs. We can immediately use it to get another missile expansion behind the sandstone cracked wall. In case the cutscene that played when the item was acquired wasn't enough, the tunnel back to the energy core makes sure players can't leave this place without knowing about bomb jumping. In the energy core, there's a cool timed puzzle we can solve with our new item. We scanned the stone toad earlier and its log stated only its interior was vulnerable. So we can turn into the morph ball to get swallowed and place a bomb inside the creature to open the way into a new room behind it. The puzzle involves using the bombs on 3 slots spread across the energy core within the time limit. Once that's done, we get access to a room with 2 morph ball paths, one low and another one up high. Scanning the tracks spoils the fact that the spider ball will be making a comeback in this game, but for now all that we can do is take the low path to grab ourselves another energy tank. A pretty good reward for a cool little timed puzzle. The corridor back to the Gathering Hall has a sandstone shortcut that allows us to skip the ions above. So all the rooms between where we got the power up and the Gathering Hall reinforce a different use of the bombs. From here we can take a slight detour back to the Watery Hall and check what's behind that sandstone wall we couldn't access before. This will grant us another missile tank, and it seems there's more to this room on its upper level, but we can't reach it yet. With that, the Arboretum is the only path forward. Much like the Watery Hall, a first-time player will probably make their way up the giant tree only to be faced with a rune door impeding their progress. This version of the puzzle seems a little meaner given the size of the room and the time it takes to go back down and search for the runes, but it's supposed to be an escalation in challenge, so it's not that egregious. Most of the rooms are easy enough to find on their way up, so maybe players will notice that there is a rune puzzle in this room before making it all the way up. It's hard to say for sure, having played the game so many times. I always remember about the rune puzzle before climbing up. The only room that was a little harder to spot was the one below the venom weeds, though if you're scanning everything, that won't be a problem since the game will tell you about it when you try to scan the red plants. With the puzzle done, we proceed to the next corridor where Reaper Vines and Venom Weeds are used in succession to create a sort of gauntlet of small-time challenges. Nothing too hard, but it keeps players sharp. These corridors also have roots overgrown in their structure, which seems to originate from our destination, the Sun Chamber, where we'll fight our next big boss battle. Every major boss serves as a punctuation in the game's pacing, so I want to take a second before the fight to comment on this section of the adventure. Despite being more open than the Orphean section, the Chozo ruins, as well as the little we've seen from the Tallon overworld, are pretty linear. Despite that, it does add a lot of side paths and optional collectibles in comparison to the game's tutorial, where the only possible detour was a small room with a map station. This segment guides the player with a lighter hand, allowing us to stumble upon dead ends that we can't overcome yet. So while the progression is strictly linear at this point, it feels more exploration-based. Just the fact that you can skip the charge beam for now, or the fact that you can already grab your first Chozo artifact, already point to a world that's starting to open up and leave the player to their own devices. Moving on, upon arriving at the Sun Chamber, we face the second boss of the game, Flagra. It's a giant insectoid plant that has been mutated and now requires constant concentrated sunlight in order to survive. Funnily enough, this is yet another fight against a stationary boss in the middle of a round arena. Its body is resistant against all weapons, so players need to knock up reflectors that power the monster up in order to stun it. Once that's done, its tentacles recede back into its flower base, and the path is clear for us to drop a morph ball bomb below it. It takes 4 repetitions for the beast to go down, and each time the number of reflectors that need to be displaced is increased accordingly. I've gotta say I love the visual design for this monster. I think it's one of the most creative ones in the game. The fight itself is also pretty fun. It signals how Prime's approach to its main boss design differs from previous 2D Metroids. In the older games, bosses were heavily focused on aggressive combat. It was all about outmaneuvering the opponent while unloading as many missiles on it as possible. Prime kinda seems to take more of a 3D Zelda approach to the bosses. They always test you on the abilities you've just acquired recently, and there's a light puzzle aspect to figuring out how to deal damage to your opponent. The music in this fight is very interesting. It's kind of sparse, contrary to the usual bombastic boss theme. I find it fits the atmosphere of the Chozo ruins quite well, while also being very fitting for a boss battle that has this heavy quote-unquote puzzle element to it. Almost as if it doesn't want to create too much distress in order to let the player think, even if the solution doesn't require that much thought. There's some more dramatic elements that come up sporadically, so it's not like the song doesn't have any energy behind it either. When Flagra dies, the animation indicates the poison that was plaguing the Chozo ruins has been cleansed. This is an interesting thing I wish the game did more often, a permanent change to the world instead of the character. Things like this are a good way to entice players to revisit other areas. And just as well, because this is the point where the game starts opening up a lot more. We also get a power-up reward for beating the boss, obviously, and this time it's the Varia suit, which allows us to resist heat damage. At this point, we have regained all of the items we had lost on the ship, with the exception of the Grapple beam. In case the player missed the fact that the water has been purified, the next corridor has some clean water we can drop down to, making it clear that the world has changed. After falling down the sun tower, the way back is closed off to us until we get the spider ball. We can still circle back to Flagra's arena through the Arboretum though, so it's not like the game is really closing any sections off. There's a Chozo lore here that explains how the Chozo locked the Great Poison behind a cipher, trying to contain its spread. It seems to confirm that the Great Poison and the poison in the waters of the Chozo ruins were not exactly the same thing. The logs for Flagra do state the creature had been mutated, like the parasite queen before it, so that's something to keep in mind. So far, Phazon has not been properly explained yet, but it's becoming clear that the poisonous waters were not what the Chozo were talking about. Up next, we reach the elevator to Magmoor Caverns. I think the idea of a new area is probably going to excite players into following the main path out of sheer curiosity, but for our purposes, there's plenty of goodies here in the ruins we can grab before moving forward. Going straight ahead, we'll look back to the Mecha Hive arena, where we'll be near a couple of missile expansions. But going the other way leads us to some unvisited rooms, so let's do that first. Reaching the Vault Room, there is another Chozo lord that expands upon their philosophy of living as one with nature. They mention using trees as the basis for their structures, which is something we've seen on full display in the Arboretum. To open the metal vault in the center, we'll need to bomb the 3 crevices on one of its walls. The first 2 are easy enough, but the highest one requires a double bomb jump. It's a technique that should be familiar to anyone who's played the previous games, but within Prime there's never any tutorial on that, so it's something players have to stumble upon by themselves. This is a good thing, by the way. Super Metroid had bomb jumping as well as wall jumping and shine sparking as hidden techniques for the player to learn, and these only improve the game. Prime is severely lacking in this regard, which is a little disappointing. Another downgrade is the bomb jumping itself. Bombs are now capped at 3 at a time, whereas older games allowed you to jump infinitely high. Speedrunners could abuse this to amazing results. Capping the number of bombs in Prime was probably a concession that had to be made to accommodate the nature of a 3D game. Super Metroid only has a couple of rooms where the player can reach the sky, whereas Prime is filled with them. Allowing players to go infinitely high would likely prove to be a big problem. After acquiring the missile tank in the vault, we can press forward to grab ourselves the energy tank on a ledge we saw earlier in the main plaza. Dropping down and following the path to the nursery, we now have the tools to solve the morph ball maze engraved on the wall, granting us another missile tank. Making our way back to the Magmoor Caverns elevator, we can make a quick stop at the ruined gallery, use the morph ball to enter the tunnel on the wall, and grab ourselves yet another missile tank. Looking at the map, the only remaining rooms unexplored in the Chozo ruins are sealed behind purple doors, meaning there's nothing we can do about them at the moment, so it's finally time to go down to the caverns. The new area begins with ominous chanting as we descend from rooms that resemble the Chozo ruins to the more cavey environments where geysers start to show up spewing orange vapor. We encounter a new save station, which is good for the players who came here immediately after the boss, and there's a quick encounter with a new enemy type. The Burrower is an aggressive enemy that jumps up in the air, throws a projectile, and quickly burrows down into the earth where it's invulnerable. They have low HP and don't deal a ton of damage either. The only minor threat they can pose is in groups, like the beetles and the war wasps before them. The next few rooms are mostly focused on minor platforming challenges. This will set the trend for what this area will offer. There's a new Grisby enemy which is functionally identical to a Zoomer, for example. Reaching the lava lake, the chanting gives way to the area's proper music, a remix of Norfair theme from Super Metroid. It's an excellent rendition with its synthesized vocals evoking a sort of ritualistic feeling. That kind of makes me wish there were more Chozo structures down here. Maybe that was the original intent, who knows. Pairing the music with an imposing new enemy that carries the namesake of the Magmoor Caverns, and this small moment definitely leaves a strong first impression of this new area. If we decided to enter this area from the Tallon overworld entrance we found way earlier, this whole build-up would be lost, which I think is sad but also kinda great. The game allows players to arrive closer to their destination in the caverns by exploring the less obvious path. But anyways, as I was saying, the Magmoors are imposing creatures with quite a bit more health and attack power than most anything we've fought up to this point. They are stationary though, which makes them more manageable. The pillar in the center here can be broken to grant us our first Chozo artifact, but I'll try not to grab any of those earlier than we have to, in the interest of discussing this quest when we reach the late game. Another new enemy in this area is the Puffer. They function like floating blast caps, the exploding poison mushrooms from the Chozo ruins. We have to shoot them from far away to avoid them exploding on contact with Samus. The Puffer's cloud feels like it lasts even a little bit longer than the blast caps does. They are a platforming challenge to complement this area's focus on that aspect of gameplay. The lava lake also introduces floating platforms that slowly lower themselves under Samus's weight. The pit tunnel forces players to go under the metal grating to get across. A new enemy type is here, the Triclops. These creatures will suck the morph ball and try to spit it back out of their lair. The goal is to lay bombs on their path while outmaneuvering them so they grab the bomb instead of Samus, causing them to explode. The next room is a very large one, but despite that, there's not much to this place. The path forward is pretty obvious, but curious players can drop down to find another metal floor with Triclops underneath, eventually leading them to a missile expansion on the storage cavern. Moving forward, we reach a proper fork on the road. The monitor station marks the return of the turrets, an enemy we hadn't seen since the Orphean frigate, so this is another indication of space pirate activity in Tallon IV, conveyed wordlessly even for those who don't read any of the logs. Going to the left will eventually lead us back to the elevator in Tallon Overworld that we encountered earlier, so it's easy to imagine that a first-time player might follow this path, wind up back at the game's starting area where a few power-ups and new rooms are available. In the interest of time, I won't play out what this scenario would look like, instead I'll just head to the other path up the monitor station. After climbing to the station's second floor, there are some panels we can scan. They mention Phazon, a name we haven't heard since the Orphean frigate, just like the turrets. That's another indication this structure belongs to the space pirates. The Chozo here weren't that big on technology, if you recall. One of these panels mentions the Monks of Grondheim. To my knowledge, these have never appeared anywhere else in the Metroid games. At first I wondered if there were plans to develop this group or if it was just adding some flavor to the world, but given other examples we'll see later, it seems like the latter option is more likely. In the transport tunnel, we have a morph ball section that's pretty straightforward, but contains a secret energy tank above the regular path. It requires 3 double bump jumps in a row. If you miss the first double jump, you fall into lava, and if you miss the other 2, you have to start from the beginning. This is a fairly challenging task if you haven't gotten the timing down. Not to mention, it comes at a point where your last save is a good while ago, probably at the beginning of the Magmoor Caverns, or worse yet, on the Tallon Overworld gunship. The closest save point is actually ahead of the player in the next area. There's no way to know that on a first playthrough. This challenge is probably a good way of teaching players that even things that can be obtained with the current kit might be best left for later. The next room is the elevator that will take us to the next area, the Phendrana Drifts. We're a short corridor away from its main hub area where one of the game's most iconic songs starts playing. The soft piano perfectly complements the falling snow, and something about high-pitched piano notes fits incredibly well with the crystalline nature of ice. I love the moments when the piano picks up the pace. It makes for quite a full, complex melody that's very pleasing to the ears. It may seem big, but there's not many places to go at the moment. There are, however, a couple of new enemies to scan. Crystallites are nothing new, they act just like Greemers or Grisbees. Flicker bats don't do anything other than fly in circles and turn invisible for a quick second. We can't even get hit by them in this room. If we try entering the only door that we can reach, we find that it's locked. Something in the environment must be scanned to open it. The metal grate right below it is a scannable item that indicates it can be broken, and scanning the panel behind it opens the door. I think this is the only instance of a puzzle like this in the game. Not functionally, there are many other paths later in the game where we'll need to scan a panel to progress, but visually this locked door is usually saved for keeping players inside a boss arena. The next corridor presents yet another new enemy. This one's a bit more interesting than the previous two. It's the Scatter Bombu. It acts as an obstacle that requires players to use the morph ball to go under it, while outmaneuvering its electric beams. As you can see in the footage, I am a master at this. A cool detail about this enemy is how it causes Samus's visor to be filled with static whenever it's nearby. Zoid Kirsch, a senior engineer for Metroid Prime, posted some interesting trivia about the game on his Twitter in celebration of its 20th anniversary. One of the pieces that I found the most interesting is that the noise texture that fills up Samus's visor is created procedurally on the spot by reading the game's ones and zeros stored in RAM. That means this texture is literally a visual representation of the code that runs Metroid Prime. I don't have anything to add to that, I just think it's amazing. The next room is the east wing of the Ice Ruins. We meet the game's most aggressive enemy yet, the baby she-goths. They function similarly to the plated beetle, only its back is vulnerable, but it's a bit slower than that, so it allows players to circle around the enemy to deal some hits without having to wait for a counterattack. They have a protective ice layer that must be destroyed before its flashy weak spot is exposed. I remember dreading these guys when I was young, but nowadays, playing on normal, they are a bit easy. A couple of charge shots can take care of them, but regardless, they are a welcome escalation in challenge from what we've seen up to this point. Further ahead, we meet the Ice Burrowers, which are literally indistinguishable from the regular single burrower we've seen on the Magmoor Caverns entrance. We loop back to the shorelines at its tallest segment, cross a room full of bombus, and arrive at the West Ice Ruins, where more baby she-goth await us. There's also a Chozo lore here. It's just the writings of a Chozo wondering whether the cradle will be able to contain the great poison. The only available path in this room is the lower one, since we can't jump high enough to reach the upper levels of these ruins. This leads us to the Phendrana Canyon. It's a bit underwhelming to get a power-up without any sort of challenge other than a few jumps across disappearing platforms. Thankfully, the power-up itself is a cool new item in the Metroid franchise, the Boost Ball. By holding the B button, it adds an impulse to the Morph Ball's movement, allowing players to build momentum. Combining this with the half-pipe structure in this room is our way out of the canyon. There's a Chozo lore here which tells us of the effects of the great poison on the minds of the Chozo. It's a cool tease for the evil Chozo enemies we'll see later on. It's cool that the boost ball is used in more organic environments rather than any super obvious key lock type system like most other power-ups, but the problem is that these half-pipe structures feel far too much at home in their environments to be something the player makes a mental note of. This means it's highly likely a first-time player won't remember where they've seen these formations before. This is an infamous section of the game, especially for people playing with the hint system turned off. Arriving back at the Phendrana shorelines, we are presented with a cutscene of Ridley flying above us. This is not here by accident. Metroid Prime has very few cutscenes, and they wouldn't waste one at this random point. Chasing Ridley is the whole reason Samus went down to the planet in the first place, so seeing him fly over the entrance of Phendrana Drifts should be a big clue that we need to leave this place. I think it's a fairly good solution to wordlessly indicate that the game world is open to be explored. Even if you pick up on this hint, I don't think it's a stretch to try to open the map and trace a line to where Ridley would probably be flying to, and that's where the problem lies. The world map is not logically laid out. Tracing the path Ridley was heading towards would lead us back to the Chozo ruins instead of Tallon Overworld, where our real next objective is. Let's play out this worst case scenario where a player heads back to the ruins. The entire path through Magmoor Caverns has absolutely nothing new to experience. It is the worst kind of backtracking the game has to offer. Once we reach the Chozo ruins, we have to remember where the half-pipes are. As I said before, I don't think it's realistic for a first-time player to have marked these places in their minds. In a worst-case scenario, this could mean the player is aimlessly revisiting every room in the ruins looking for half-pipes. This could be mitigated if the player hasn't done the optional item roundup I did after grabbing the Varia suit. At least then, this tedious search wouldn't be a total waste, as they would be picking up some collectibles along the way. Since I do know where the half-pipes are, we can go straight to them. The first one is in the main plaza, and it yields a missile expansion. The second one is in the ruined shrine and also rewards us with a missile expansion. The sad thing is that all of this could have been avoided if the tunnel leading to the Phendrana Drifts entrance was a little more tilted to the right. I legitimately think if that was the case, it would be a lot harder to blame the game for players getting lost at this point. After all that, we exhausted what we could do in this area, so it's time to explore other options. The only other place left to go is Tallon Overworld. Arriving through the Chozo Ruins elevator mercifully puts us immediately in front of the half-pipe we've been looking for. I want to take a moment to praise the implementation of the morph ball. The transition from first to third person camera happens seamlessly and adapts perfectly to a variety of environments. Not only does it frame things well in more contained environments like the side-scroller mazes and these half-pipes, but it also follows the morph ball well in more freeform environments. Apparently, Metroid Prime began development as a third-person game, and was only changed to first-person due to Nintendo's interference. It seems Retro managed to salvage a lot of that early work though, because this third-person camera is fairly robust for the time. After crossing a previously unreachable ledge at the landing site, we managed to grab ourselves the space jump boots. It is another item that has been downgraded from how it works in the 2D games. In those, it functions as an infinite jump. In Prime, it has been reduced to a simple double jump, probably for the same reasons the morph ball bombs have been now capped to just 3. That being said, the combination of the boost ball and the double jump greatly increases our mobility options in a game that's generally pretty slow paced, in great contrast to its 2D counterparts. There's a few things we can do from the landing site now that we're back here with a much greater arsenal. The first thing is grabbing a missile expansion on this hidden morph ball tunnel below us. Next, there's a room I forgot to visit when we first landed. It's tucked away inside this small cave. It leads to a small waterfall area where we wouldn't be able to go through without the morph ball and the missile launcher. On the other side, we find flying space pirates. These will be regular enemies later on, but here they shoot at the player only for a short while before flying away. We know the space pirates were here in the past, and there have been clues that they were still around, but this is confirmation. With that in mind, these pirates probably fly away to warn the others that Samus Aran is in Tallon IV. That interpretation only works if you visit this place at this point, however, as it wouldn't make much sense for them to warn the others after you've already raided some space pirate bases. These two were watching over a couple of crates we've seen before in the Orpheon frigate. This time, they are leaking a blue substance that hurts Samus upon contact. This is the first time we actually get to see Phazon in gameplay. Across the lake, we can see the remnants of a crashed spaceship, but at this point we can't know that it is actually the Orpheon frigate from the beginning of the game. For the longest time, I wasn't even sure if that was really the case, since the timeline of this crash kinda doesn't make a whole lot of sense. How did it arrive here faster than Samus? And if it didn't, how did it crash without us noticing? It just doesn't match up. With the double jump, we can cross the lake to the other side, but our progress is halted by a white door. Heading back to the landing site, we can go to the impact crater and make some more progress than we did last time. The first thing a player is likely to notice is that the large window looks suspiciously like Samus's visor. This is a cool way to hint at the relationship Samus has to the bird species, even if the player is unfamiliar with the series lore. This place has a couple of Chozo inscriptions, the first of which has lore implications for all of the previous games in the series, as it explains the significance of the Chozo statues, how they are used as guides and as enemies in the series. This will become relevant to Prime in a bit, as we'll start coming across a couple of statues in this game. The second piece of lore is about the space pirates trying to open the cradle where the great poison is. It seems to indicate that though the Chozo have arrived first, their time did overlap with the space pirates' occupation. Reaching the open area with the totems, we are able to collect our first Chozo artifact, the Artifact of Truth. Upon grabbing it, we are told there are 12 of them scattered around the planet, and collecting them is our ticket inside the impact crater. Given all of the Chozo lores we've scanned, it's easy to start forming a picture of what's going on. A meteor struck Tallon IV at this location. It brought with it what the Chozo called the Great Poison, which began corrupting the land. They built the cradle and the cipher to seal the source of the poison, but it seems they were too late as it began infecting their minds. That's about all we know so far. I don't think there has been an explicit connection made between the Great Poison and the Phazon substance yet, but I imagine it's not hard at this point to put it together that they are the same thing. The space pirate data at the entrance of the crater says they are interested in harnessing the energy sealed behind the cradle, so it's only logical that the substance they keep talking about and using to experiment on the parasite queens would be the same one. Flagra was also a mutated creature, and I think one of the artifact clues here even mentions that the monster was mutated by the Great Poison. Speaking of clues, scanning the totems here will grant us hints about the locations of the other 11 artifacts. These are fun little riddles to solve. It offers a different way of engaging with the world in a sort of detective mode, which I really like. The only big asterisk here is, why can't we just scan all the clues at once? There's really no reason for the game to send us on a chase through the world trying to find these items and then forcing us to come back here to scan more totems and go on the same journey again and again. As I said before, we'll leave the artifact hunt mostly to the final stretch of the journey. It's an infamous section of the game, and I want to look at it as closely to the perspective of a first-time player as possible. After grabbing the space jump boots, there is no clear indication of where to go next. Much like the boost ball, or maybe even more so, it's hard to make a mental note of every ledge that might be out of reach. That being said, I don't think it's a stretch to presume players will want to explore Magmoor Caverns and Phendrana Drifts, more so than the other areas, for no other reason than the novelty of these new places. Magmoor is first, but we're going down the Tallon overworld entrance this time. On the way to the Phendrana Drifts, we can grab a missile tank on this scaffolding. It's a fun small challenge to carefully balance the morph ball here. This next tunnel has a broken section in the middle, and it should be a somewhat familiar setup to anyone who's played Super Metroid. The solution is a little easier to deduce this time around thanks to the scan visor, but we'll be back here when we have what we need. After climbing up the monitor station again, a player might notice a new platform is now reachable, meaning we can climb a bit further up the station to reach a spinner device. a mechanism activated by the boost ball, giving it extra functionality. The device opens a path to a shrine where a Chozo statue is holding the artifact of strength. The artifact clue states that the caverns were training grounds for Chozo warriors, so it makes sense that this symbol of strength is here. What does not make sense is why is this artifact here, unguarded, right beside a space pirate base? Worse yet, the base has a drawbridge specifically for the purposes of reaching this room, so this doesn't track with the pirates' previous logs where they say they are collecting these artifacts to harness the source of the Phazon. There's a Benesium floor here that would lead us to a secret room we can see on the map, but we don't have the tools to open this quite yet. Back on track to Phendrana Drifts, we arrive on the shorelines and immediately a player might notice these floating platforms that were out of reach before but are now allowing them to reach the ruined structure on the right. Scanning around here, we find a cordite wall that we can't break yet. The game always highlights the material of breakable objects in their scans, but it's up to the player to make the proper associations between what weapon can be used to break what materials. The next corridor has a pulse bamboo right in front of an ice wall. I haven't commented on these yet because they were nothing but simple obstacles that permanently disappeared after they are destroyed, but here they have a synergy with the bamboo to create an interesting interaction. You can only break these walls using the charge beam, but that draws the bamboo towards you. Honestly, it feels like a bit of a missed opportunity to not have more situations like this. Another detail I didn't mention yet is that standing close to the bamboo explosions lets us see a reflection of Sam's face on the visor. It's one of the most memorable little visor interactions. After that, we reach the Chozo Ice Temple. A song similar to the one that plays in the Impact Crater starts playing here, indicating that this is a sacred place for the Chozo. There's a giant statue whose triangular shape almost seems to point upwards to indicate our destination. Its description says this is a depiction of the Chozo balancing the plane of existence, which is appropriate for a species that would give up everything to save Tallon IV. While climbing, we find ice parasites, which are pretty unremarkable enemies. They're basically obstacles just like the crystallites, but even less resistance, so they don't even require the player to spend a missile on them. The central statue on the upper floor has some frozen water coming out of its mouth. It seems significant, but there's nothing to do with it at this point. There's a simple puzzle we need to solve in order to proceed where a grate with a Shaman Chozo statue is blocking the path forward. Upon scanning it, it asks you to find its twin in the environment. There are 4 statues of Chozo faces along the walls: an architect, a philosopher, a warrior, and a shaman. The last one has some cracks on it, so we break it with a missile to reveal a bomb slot behind it, opening the way forward. I wish the game would make the faces more visually distinct, or at least make one of them visually cracked, but what I love about this puzzle is how it tells us what kinds of occupations were valued by Chozo society in a fairly nonchalant way. We cross a short morph ball maze and arrive at the Chapel of the Elders. As we're about to grab the wave beam, 4 baby she-goths start attacking us. This quote-unquote trap is very obvious given the size of the arena, and fighting a few baby she-goths to then bring on the adult she-goth is the same setup as the plated beetle all the way back in the Chozo ruins. I do like the design of this room, however, because its 4 chambers on its corners match the number of valued Chozo professions we saw earlier. So, combined with the name Chapel of the Elders, it's easy to interpret that one elder of each occupation would have their own dedicated space in this room at one point. Back to the mini-boss, the adult she-goth is a pretty good fight. It's probably the most traditional fight in Prime, if I'm being honest. The she-goth is invulnerable to beams, so it's a fight that requires the use of missiles. And even those need to be fired when the creature has its mouth open after using its icy breath attack. Similar to the way you would kill Kraid or Crockmire in Super Metroid. In that game, a charge beam works as well in case you run out of missiles, but in Prime, if that happens, the other way we can damage the she-goth is by dropping bombs underneath its belly. It's a messy method, and it's way more likely that you'll suffer some damage in the process of dealing damage. Most bosses in Prime have one correct way of killing them. Sheogoth is probably one of the few exceptions where there are these two methods. I remember this as a huge difficulty spike when I first played the game as a kid. Baby Sheogoths were already hard enough for me back then. Nowadays, this is relatively easy, especially when playing on normal, but it is a sufficient escalation in challenge. Overall, I think the game has a nice progression curve, and the next area we'll visit, deeper into Phendrana, will also make combat progressively more involved. One disappointing thing is that Sheogoth is one of the last mini-bosses in the game, and we're only a third of the way through it. Prime's development is infamous for the ridiculous crunch the dev team had to endure during its final year. I wouldn't be surprised if the power-ups we get without any mini-boss encounters or any puzzle challenges are a result of cut content. It's a shame when you learn that a game that brings you so much joy was made under these conditions, especially when, more often than not, executives get a fat bonus off of its success, while the entire QA team gets fired or something. Our society's values are completely backwards. After Sheogoth is defeated, we obtain the Wave Beam, so I think it's a good time to talk about the button mapping in Metroid Prime. Despite being released on the GameCube, which had 2 analog sticks, Prime opts to use the same approach to controls that an N64 FPS would take, meaning all movement is done with the left analog stick, and aiming vertically requires the player to stand still while holding an extra button that changes the effects of using the same analog stick. The reason for that is leaving the C stick, the one on the right side of the controller, free to be used as a beam selector button. The story goes that right before the game was about to ship, Shigeru Miyamoto came in and remapped the game's controls himself. The staff at Retro weren't 100% happy with their original scheme, and so Miyamoto's help was greatly appreciated. Metroid Prime uses every button on the GameCube controller, so it kind of justifies its weird control scheme in my opinion. Nowadays, with the remaster, there's an alternate control option that actually uses the dual analog setup most modern shooters take advantage of. A Switch controller only has one extra shoulder button over the GameCube, so in order to free up the right analog stick to be used for aiming, switching beams involves holding down a face button and then using the analog to push in the direction of the beam you want. This is similar to what the Wii ports of the game did. I know I'm going to sound crazy to a lot of you, but I've never really enjoyed these revisions on Prime's control scheme. The game is not meant to be a shooter in the first place. There are almost no instances where precise aiming is required, so I don't understand the advantages of using free aim controls. I will concede that it does make movement more intuitive, so maybe I'm just being a nostalgia-blinded purist, but the original controls give the game such a distinct identity in my mind, it's hard for me to think in any other way about the game. The truth is that even as I type this part of the script, I realize I sound like the old man screams at cloud meme, so feel free to ignore this rant. As you probably noticed from the footage, one of the first useful new abilities the Wave Beam has is electricity. This allows us to kill the previously invincible bomb boosts by supercharging them with energy. The beam retains a bit of its ability of phasing through walls from the previous 2D Metroids, but to a much lesser extent, unfortunately. The electricity can also be used to energize inactive conduits, and it has a stun effect on enemies. Both of these features we'll see in a bit. Another improvement of the map system over its predecessors is that it indicates what type of door separates the rooms we've visited. Looking at the map, there are 2 purple doors in Chozo ruins and 1 here in Phendrana. We wouldn't be able to access the ones in the ruins because the magma pool requires the grapple beam, and the other one on the ruined shrine requires the spider ball. After the wild goose chase for the space boots, I think most players will want to stay in Phendrana anyways. In the shorelines, we can use another floating platform to skip the east ice ruins on the path back to the western ice ruins. In this room, we can now use the double jump to reach the rooftops of the ruins. From here, we can use a missile to drop a stalactite to create a platform. It's a simple but effective environmental interaction, and the game will do a little more with these later on. This room also has one of the most cruel moments for those seeking to 100% the game. There's a new enemy called the Ice Shriekbats, which I scanned as soon as I entered the room to make sure I didn't forget. I even let them explode on me to see if they had any freezing powers or anything that distinguishes them from the regular Shriekbats, but nope. These enemies are only in this room. They destroy themselves when they spot you. They look almost identical to another enemy you probably already scanned, and they disappear from this room forever after you reach the Space Pirate base, which is less than 10 minutes ahead. It's incredibly easy to miss this scan for these guys, and it will ruin your 100% run if you're not careful. Reaching the ruined courtyard, we have a time challenge to solve in order to reach the top level. After activating 2 spinner devices and 1 bomb slot, the water begins to rise, creating a path to a hole in the wall where we can grab an extra energy tank. Unfortunately, that puts us back on the lower level, so we need to do the time challenge again, walk past that hole in the wall to actually reach the upper level. There are 3 doors up here. One is deactivated and we can't do anything to it yet. The other one is a metal door and the last one is a purple door. If you go to the metal door, you'll find a save station. I think it's kind of clever that the game has these 2 paths, one that uses the power-up you've just acquired and the other one that uses a power-up that you had from way before. That kind of indicates which path is the critical path forward and which path is a side path. That helps when you're trying to discern which way to go, and you find a save station here, which is always nice. Here in the save station, there's a scan that tells us about a research lab Hydra heading south through the purple doors. So like I said, that's where we're going next. Right off the bat, a turret is guarding the entrance, and we have this opportunity to see how the wave beam has a different effect on certain enemies. Instead of simply blowing it up, the wave beam short-circuits it, making it fire uncontrollably in all directions. This can be dangerous for the players, so maybe it's best to use the charge beam on these enemies instead. We don't get a lot of time to take in this new effect because a shadow pirate starts harassing us immediately. I find it a little weird that this guy is here. In the very next room, we'll get a proper reintroduction to regular space pirates, which we'll be fighting almost exclusively up until we get the thermal visor. Only then, shadow pirates will start spawning in groups. So this one feels a little out of place. Anyways, as I said, this room is our re-encounter with the space pirates, except this time they aren't injured like the ones on the space frigate. These guys are a definite escalation in terms of aggressiveness. They are mobile, they have different attacks for short and long range, they can climb walls and jump to platforms. After dealing with the bugs, plants, and animals of Tallon IV, dealing with a sapient species feels appropriately more involved. They also come accompanied by their own theme song when engaged in combat. It's an age-old trick, but you can actually determine whether there are enemies left in any given room just by what song is currently playing. On the back of the room, we find a map station. Looking at what we obtained, we can see the path forward is winding but mostly linear. There are some scan panels nearby that talk about a Project Titan that has been quarantined off. This is foreshadowing for the boss we'll fight later on. Moving on, the next room of note is the research lab Hydra. This place is packed with space pirates and things to scan, which will be a recurring motif for almost all the rooms in this section of the game. After dispatching the pirates, I took my time reading through the logs here. There are 5 pirate data logs. The first one is about the pirates having to deal with the local wildlife of Tallon IV as they build their base. The second one tells us of the pirates discovering the origins of Phazon, giving us a date for the meteor strike of 20 years ago, though this has been retconned on later versions to be 50 years ago instead. The third one talks about the Phazon mining operations and the dangers of what they call Phazon madness. The fourth one is about the pirates' first experiments with Phazon infusions on parasites. We already know how that ended up from the beginning of the game. And finally, the last one reveals the pirates are infusing Metroids with Phazon, and they were moved to Phendrana due to its cold climate in an attempt to keep the creatures docile. There are plenty of other scannable panels that don't count towards 100% completion as well. One of them tells of the pirates trying to exterminate ice beetles, which we'll find inside the base in a few minutes. It corroborates the pirate data about the troubles of dealing with the wildlife and their failure to contain it. Many scans talk about xenomes being infused with Phazon. If you pay attention, you can deduce they are actually talking about Metroids before getting the confirmation from that last pirate data log I just talked about. Pressing forward, we reach the observatory. The same cadence from the research lab plays out here. We are greeted by half a dozen space pirates. After they are eliminated, there's a bunch of scannable goodies for us to collect. The one difference is there's a basic quote-unquote puzzle that needs to be solved before we can climb up to the next level. Before starting on the solution, there's a couple more pirate data logs to be scanned here on the lower level. The first tells of a sudden energy spike that drove the space pirates to Tallon IV, and the second is about their arrival and terraforming efforts on the planet. This whole terraforming business is a little confusing to me. I thought terraforming meant altering the atmosphere of a planet to suit a different species, but there are no signs that that's what happened here. Maybe they just mean putting doors everywhere, which would make it make sense that the doors from the frigate are the same as the ones in the planet. I don't think that tracks though. Most of the Chozo artifacts haven't been found by the pirates, yet they are still hidden behind the same kinds of doors. Anyways, I don't want to harp on about doors any more than I already have. The puzzle solution is basically a mindless checklist of 2 bomb slots and 4 spinner devices, but it's cool to gradually put this machine together, especially when the reward is this visually distinct, lore-filled giant hologram. I really enjoyed learning about the planets and the solar system with its sapient gases and nuclear winters, but most of all, I just discovered Zebes is part of the same system as Tallon IV. And I kid you not, that kind of came as a shock to me, even though I've probably read this log before, but I guess it must have been a while because I didn't remember that. At the top of the hologram, there's a metal door which, like I mentioned earlier, contains a safe station behind it. While crossing to the other side of the hologram, we grab ourselves the super missile. This is the weirdest power-up we get in the game. There's no mini-boss, no puzzle that requires more than a couple brain cells, and to top it all off, the game doesn't even train you to use the new power. It's easy to imagine a scenario where a player could forget all about this ability if they turn off the game for a while after getting it. At least, I hope it's easy to imagine that because it happened to me on my first playthrough. The door that leads to the next major boss requires the player to blow up a cordite structure before using the wave beam on some conduits. But I didn't remember I had something that could blow that kind of stuff up, and I didn't know English at the time, so it took me quite a while before I managed to get to Thardus. The next room is an open area where we fight some more space pirates before flying space pirates show up. We've seen them before on Tallon Overworld, but this is our first proper fight with them. I like that the game is introducing so many pirate types in this section. It makes me feel like this base is more complex than it would be otherwise. Flying pirates only show up at the rooftops on open air, and shadow pirates only show up in darkness later on, except for that weird one at the beginning. Well, we don't talk about that one. Back inside the base, we stumble upon the game's first Metroid. A short cutscene plays, emphasizing the enemy's significance. After regaining control, the player might think the evil jellyfish is contained by the tank, but it immediately breaks free and starts assaulting Samus. Metroids in Prime function in similar fashion to the 2D games. They latch on to the player and slowly drain their energy. The only way to get rid of them is with a morph ball bomb. Because the game is in first person, they also block the player's view, which is kind of gross, but a cool new perspective on something we've been dealing with since 1986. The biggest difference in this incarnation is that any kind of beam can hurt them. The way Metroids are killed is a bit inconsistent throughout the series. The first game required them to be frozen with the ice beam, then hit with 5 missiles. In Metroid 2, that requirement is still true, but only for their larval state. In Prime, any beam can hurt a regular Metroid. They're only invulnerable when electricity is flowing out of their bodies. I think the game justifies the difference from previous games based on the fact that these Metroids have been weakened by the Phazon infusions. In this room, I also remember about the super missiles and tried them out on space pirates. They are probably overkill for how powerful they are, but it's kind of a video game staple. You get a new weapon, you gotta try it out. The super missile in Prime acts as a combination of the power beam and a missile. They spend the same resources, with the super variety costing 5 missiles. If the player tries using a super missile with a charged wave beam, they'll notice that won't work. Maybe they wonder if there will be an equivalent super missile to each beam, but that's a question for later. This room also has another 5 pirate data logs. The first is about Ridley's reconstruction after the events of the first Metroid. The second recounts the early stages of Phazon experiments on Metroids. The third is about the early experiments on space pirates themselves. They codenamed the project Helix, probably as a reference to altering their DNA. The fourth is about pirates' research to try to understand and replicate the Metroid's life-draining capabilities. And the last one is sort of a continuation of that research, where the pirates realize that replicating the Metroid power is futile, so they rather research how to train the creatures for military purposes. We're still not done with this room, because there are a couple of optional power-ups available here. There's an energy tank inside one of the experiment tanks. Nothing a simple missile can't handle, so this one's a freebie. A missile expansion is hidden here as well in sort of a catwalk that requires the player to balance the morph ball along a winding path. It's a slightly harder version of the missile expansion we got recently on Magmoor Caverns. Eventually we reach the research core. At the bottom of this room, the thermal visor is sitting inside an energy field that prevents us from grabbing it, so we need to deactivate it by scanning 3 terminals. I like that you can follow the glowing cables to find where the computers are, but I think it's a little pointless to have a first-time player go all the way down just to have them go back up looking for these computers. Once we grab the visor, the whole facility goes dark, and shadow pirates replace the regular pirates. These enemies have a sort of cloaking device that makes them hard to spot in the dark, but also draws a lot of energy. Because of that, they can't use ranged weapons, resorting to melee combat only. Of course, we can use our new thermal visor to spot them pretty easily. So the story goes that the Prime dev team came up with the concept of different visors after a cryptic hint from Shigeru Miyamoto, where he asked something along the lines of how would the game be played if Samus had the head of a bug. The team thought that was super weird, but they came to understand he was talking about changing perceptions of the world. Back then, this was an ambitious undertaking, making the whole world render in a different way with a press of a button. It was, and in some regards still is, an impressive feature to pull off and integrate so effortlessly into the gameplay. One other thing I really like about this room is how dark it gets. I kind of wish more rooms in the game looked like this and forced you to use the thermal visor to get around. This level of darkness is what I expected a room where plasmides have been killed would look like. The blackout also caused the door leading out of this room to deactivate. This serves to teach us how we can use the wave beam's electricity to reactivate conduits. Not sure it makes a whole lot of sense for deactivated conduits to give off hit signatures, but I'm just nitpicking. The next room has sentry drones replacing the ice beetles. These enemies lock the doors whenever we face them. Because they are metallic, robotic opponents, they aren't detected by the thermal visor, which is also true of turrets. It's a good way to make the player switch between visors, but the game never synergizes them with some shadow pirates, which is a bit of a shame. In general, the sentry's abilities to lock doors feel underutilized. There's not much new content on the way back to the ruined courtyard, other than fighting shadow pirates and sentry drones in the dark instead of regular pirates. There's also a missile expansion stuck inside a cordite tank which we can break now that we have the super missile. So it's not the best kind of backtracking, but at least it puts the new items to use. Once we reach the courtyard, we have all the tools we need to reactivate the door to the quarantine area. A super missile breaks the cordite structure and exposes the conduit to be shot by the wave beam. Like I did before fighting Flagra, I want to discuss my impressions of this section of the game with a broader lens. After dealing with the boss in the Chozo ruins, the game opens up to an even greater degree than what we saw previously, where all of the intended progression was focused in a single area. This time around, 2 new places are introduced, and a revisit to Tallon Overworld is also on the required path. I discussed how I think the game kind of fumbles the execution of this revisit, but its significance is mostly as a means of letting players know that from this point forward, the intended path is no longer contained within a single area. Another thing I liked from this section is the variety within Phendrana itself. The shorelines feel completely different than the Space Pirate base. Chozo Ruins kind of had 2 distinct atmospheres when comparing the arid main plaza to the more lush Arboretum, but Phendrana's sub-areas kind of make a greater impression with their contrast. Maybe the game could have benefited a bit from locking off Chozo Ruins from being revisited until we acquire a certain item, like how Super Metroid drops the player down a long shaft that cuts them off from backtracking to Upper Brimstar until they get the Ice Beam. Something like that could still allow for a greater sense of exploration without running the risk of players getting the wrong idea when it's time to get these space boots, for example. After a short morph ball corridor, we reach the game's 3rd boss fight. Thardos is a massive sentient rock monster. At this point, I'm a bit unclear whether it's just regular rocks that have been given sentience by Phazon infusions, or if it was already a rock creature before Phazon exposure, but we'll get confirmation on that later on. It's also the first boss that actually moves around the arena, which is exciting, but as we'll see, there are also some downsides to this newfound mobility. To kill it, we must use the thermal visor to identify which part of the creature is active with Phazon. I like that we can't lock on to the creature otherwise because it's actually just a pile of rocks. A super missile can blast that rock open to expose the Phazon core, but the radiation overwhelms the thermal visor, forcing us to go back to the combat visor. Another super missile blast can destroy the Phazon core, and the process starts again. All other weapons can also damage the rocks, but they obviously take more time. A total of 7 rocks must be destroyed before the battle is over. After each cycle, Thardos rolls into a ball, and using the boost ball can help you avoid being crushed. I just found out you can actually drop a morph ball bomb at this point as an alternative method of exposing a Phazon core, but I actually never tried that myself. I've praised the camera system of the morph ball before, but in this fight I feel it really drops the ball. It seems the camera in this room was tuned to frame the spider ball tracks on the room's circumference, and that is absolutely the opposite of what you would want to look at in this situation. Other than rolling, Thardos can attack by hurling rocks at the player, as well as using an ultra-frigid beam that can freeze Samus in place. After 3 of its body parts have been destroyed, Thardos will shroud the arena with a thick fog to make it harder to see with the combat visor, but thanks to the lock-on mechanic, that's relatively easy to deal with. After 6 parts are destroyed, the fog is reabsorbed by the boss, and it becomes a bit more aggressive. The music for this fight starts with the use of the piano as a link between it and the theme for Phendrana Drifts. But its pacing is much faster and creepier, evoking a feeling similar to horror movie themes like Halloween or The Exorcist. When the percussion kicks in, it has an industrial quality which carries a lot of the energy of the track to make up for the piano, which, while creepy, is maybe a little too soft for an intense boss battle. Thardos is a definite step up in difficulty from Flagra. As I'm nearing the end of the fight, you can see I lost 4 energy tanks in total. Of course, I didn't reveal my ultimate gamer form in this footage, but if I wasn't doing a 100% run and consequently had less tanks at my disposal, this could have easily been my first game over. Our reward for killing the monster is the Spider Ball. This is a returning item from Metroid 2, but much like the space jump, this version is downgraded to accommodate the 3D world design. In Metroid 2, the Spider Ball allows Samus to cling to almost all surfaces, while here the power-up only works in designated tracks. It's probably the only way the devs could make it work, and these tracks will be put to good use on later segments. Using the spider ball, we can reach a new elevator to the Magmoor Caverns south. Upon arriving, a metal door is right behind us, giving access to a save station. Always a welcome sight after a boss fight. The next big room we go to has 3 flying space pirates waiting for us. This is interesting because it is the first time we'll face them in the caverns. This is the first indication that space pirates are out of their bases hunting for Samus and will now be showing up more prominently throughout the game. This room also contains a time challenge. Upon activating the conduits for each hatch, the cooling system starts to freeze some parts of the underground lava streams, allowing us to traverse through other paths of the morph ball section. Eventually this will lead us to a new energy tank. Following the path to the right of the entrance leads us to a pile of rubble we can't break yet, so we must go left for now. In the next room we encounter a puddle spore as a new platforming type enemy. They're pretty simple platforms that flip over if you're too slow to get across. The geothermal core is a big room that seems pretty significant, but there's not much to do here at the moment. The next room is much more of what we are used to from Magmoor Caverns. Some lava lakes with Magmoors, puffers, and the occasional flamethrower on the wall. There's a cool little moment where you can shoot a stalactite to drop it on a Magmoor and kill it instantly. These environmental kills are rare, but always a welcome change of pace. As we reach the familiar Tallon overworld elevator, I look at the map to reason about where to go next. There are no new rooms to explore in Magmoor ahead of us. Tallon overworld is also fully explored at the moment, and we just left Phendrana Drifts. That leaves only the Chozo ruins as our next destination, and the quickest way to reach it is to go up to Tallon overworld and head to the ruins from there. Immediately you might notice the music has changed. It's much more energetic than the Criteria remix we had previously associated with this area. There's a theremin line in this new song that sounds incredibly similar to the one from the Chozo Ruins theme. I even had to double check to make sure they weren't exactly the same. I'm not entirely sure why this change takes place other than that's what Super Metroid did with Criteria, so that's what Prime has to do with Tallon Overworld. It feels a little bit derivative, but it's hard to complain too much when the songs are this good. At the ruins, we head for the ruined shrine where we fought the plated beetle. Using the boost ball and the newly acquired spider ball, we can reach the wave beam door on the upper level to reach the Tower of Light. Here there's a room at the bottom, but it's inaccessible since it's underwater. Our only option at the moment is to go up. At a certain point, the platforms are too tall even for the double jump to reach. Scanning around, we spot cracks on each of the 4 pillars around the tower's walls. 3 missiles are required to crack each one of these. Once all 4 are cracked, the whole room drops down a few meters, enough for us to go a bit further up. The player has to do this 2 more times before reaching the top for a total of 36 missiles spent on this challenge. And that's if they don't accidentally miss any of them by firing into the Oculus enemies, which are completely indestructible and roam around the cracks to waste our missiles. On the last level, there are even some plated variants of poisonous puffers which might knock the player down the tower. At the top sits the Wave Buster, one of the 3 optional missile combos in Metroid Prime. Each of the 4 beams we'll have at our disposal later in the game has a missile combo. The Super Missile combines with the Power Beam and is the only one required to beat the game. The Wave Booster is not just a reskin of the Super Missile either, it behaves in a different way. It's a stream of electricity a la Ghostbusters and consumes missiles gradually as long as it's active. In a game with 49 missile expansions and 14 energy tanks, most of the optional stuff players will find are somewhat predictable, so stumbling upon a whole new weapon is such a great reward. And better yet, they make the abundant missile expansions even more valuable. Now, I feel like the Wave Buster is pretty close to the path an average player will take on their first playthrough, so there's a flip side to having such a unique weapon so close to the main path. There's a chance players won't know it's meant to be a secret optional goodie, and they'll try to reason about where this new power-up could be used. This never happened to me, and I haven't found anyone online complaining about it, so maybe this is just a theoretical problem that doesn't really apply to reality. But it feels like there's a risk of players running around aimlessly trying to find the use for this power-up. After getting the Wave Buster, the question remains, where is our next objective? The magma pool still has some unexplored rooms behind it, but we would need the grapple beam first. Looking at the map, it seems like we are out of options in the ruins, but if you look closely you might notice a morph ball tunnel appendage coming out of the furnace. That's our next objective. I think this room could have been broken up into two rooms, one for the morph ball maze section and another for the furnace proper. This would probably make it easier to tell that you haven't visited the main part of the room yet, giving a clearer indication of places left to explore. On the way there, we can stop at the ruined fountain to grab a missile expansion. Now that the water from the ruins is clean, we can use the fountain to launch the morph ball up towards the ceiling where a spider track will lead us to the expansion. To enter the main room in the furnace, we need to use the spider tracks to reach the upper level of the morph ball maze. This place has some timed platforms, which I think only appear in one other place in the game, and we have to time a bomb properly to get across. The furnace has some spider ball tracks leading to the ceiling, with some indestructible plated parasites crawling about, but there's no way to reach it yet. There's a Chozo lore here teasing the Chozo ghost enemies we'll meet in a bit. They speak of the Chozo's race against time to complete the cradle and contain the grey poison before it corrupts their minds. Leaving through the morph ball tunnel, we reach the crossway. It's a big half-pipe room with an optional puzzle to solve. Before that, there are 3 new Chozo lores for us to scan. The first one talks about the moment the space pirates started invading, confirming once again that the Chozo's time overlapped with the space pirates'. The next lore tells of the Chozo starting to have visions of Samus as a prophesied hero that will save them from the Great Poison and the space pirates. I feel like there are 3 or 4 lores that are mostly the same as this one. The final one speaks of the Worm, a creature inside the meteor that spreads the Great Poison. It is the first time we hear about this creature, which we'll later learn the space pirates have named Metroid Prime. I think it's pretty cool that the title is actually revealed to be an enemy in the game and not just words that sound cool together, but we're not quite there yet. Back on the half-pipe, we can use it to plant a bomb on a morph ball slot. This opens up a spider ball track that we can follow to a new missile expansion. Arriving at the Hall of the Elders, we'll have our first fight with a Chozo ghost. They are technically not ghosts, but rather bioelectrical beings that shift through dimensions, but that's just the writers trying to give a sci-fi spin to their fantasy monster. These enemies are resistant to all beams other than the power beam, and they can become invisible and dash away after attacking or getting hit. From what I can gather, the Chozo were already ghost-like due to their connection to nature, but the Phazon corruption is what made them violent. They still protect Chozo sacred places, but they can't distinguish between friend or foe. There might also be another reason why the Chozo are aggressive to Samus, but I'll discuss that in a later lore entry. At this point, these are very annoying enemies, since there's no way to keep track of them. You can only land a single hit before they vanish, and sometimes they'll attack you from behind. I found the most efficient way to dispatch them is to fire 1 charge beam shot and 1 super missile, but since you can't keep track of them yet, sometimes I'll get them confused and waste 2 super missiles on a single enemy, or hit the same enemy with 2 charge shots, which isn't enough to kill it. As annoying as these enemies can be at this point, I like how intimidating they are now versus how much simpler they become after acquiring the X-ray visor. Here we also find our very first missile station. There are only 3 of those in the entire game. Both of the other ones are right before bosses, so this one sticks out because there's no real need for it to be here other than the next room we go to where there are 2 metal doors. It's not a good enough excuse because some simple crates that always spawn a missile recharge would suffice to make sure players are still progressing effortlessly if that was the intention. I'm not against having missile stations that don't necessarily have an obvious use and are placed more as a convenience to the player, but if that's the case, then it's weird that there are so few of them. Finally, the Hall of the Elders also houses another Chozo lore. It's another one talking about Samus as the hero that's prophesied to save them. They build the cradle to stop the poison, but they kind of know that it won't be enough to save the planet, so they place all their hopes on Samus's future arrival. To move forward, we need to find a way around the force field that's blocking the upper door. There are 3 morph ball slots blocked by colored barriers. Each one needs to be broken by the respective color being, and each one alters the room in a small way. Right now, only the purple barrier can be broken with the wave beam, which will then activate an alternate path for the Chozo statue to throw Samus in that drops her behind the force field. We can scan a panel to permanently shut it down. Not doing so at this moment means having to repeat the purple barrier path every time. A little under a minute of wasted time feels like a fitting punishment for not paying the minimal amount of attention to the world. The next room is the reflecting pool, in which we must drain the titular pool in order to reveal a half-pipe and leverage the boost ball to ascend to the upper levels. There are stone toads spread around the pool and the balcony, ready to swallow up the morph ball, but they can actually be relatively useful in that way, since a simple bomb lets the player walk without a scratch and easily lands them at the upper level. Up here, there's a white door we can't access and 2 metal doors for us to choose. I chose the one on the left, which grants us the ice beam. The other one leads to a save station and a morph ball tunnel to the Tallon Overworld East elevator. The white door can now be opened to reveal a path to the Tallon Overworld South elevator as well. That's actually quite a lot all at once. Without any fanfare, we are given a new beam that can open white doors and freeze enemies in place. I guess the main challenge before getting this item was the first Chozo ghost encounter, but they're not very related, taking place in different rooms and all that, but I digress. All of a sudden, we have 3 immediate points of interest to follow. The elevators are 2 of them, but another one is going back to the Hall of the Elders and checking out what changes if we activate the white morph ball slot. This gives us a new energy tank, which is always a nice find, but it will also make evident another one of the biggest problems when fighting Chozo ghosts. They respawn constantly. Since we're back here, we can check what's behind the other white doors, but they're just corridors looping back to previous areas. It's always nice to have some shortcuts when combing through rooms for power-ups you might have missed, but it's not very useful at the moment. Looking at where the 2 elevators from the reflecting pool will lead us, it seems at first that taking the south elevator is the more obvious path, mostly because it's the path behind the white door. It would make sense that you should follow the path opened by the item you just recently acquired, right? Well, not quite. Going through this path, we'll reach the Great Tree Hall, which has many paths coming out of it, but none that we can access yet. The topmost has a Bendasium rock blocking the way. Below that, we can't reach the door behind the tree without the X-ray visor or some very acute perception to notice the raindrops on the invisible platform. And all the doors below the one we came from are locked behind a gate that we can't open from this side. With our options here exhausted, the most obvious path forward is to go to Tallon Overworld East. The placement of these elevators makes no sense. It's a weird fact about the map of Tallon IV. Sometimes it makes logical sense, but other times it doesn't. There's a really cool moment later on where we can see the impact crater from a different angle and it matches exactly where it should be, but other times you can have these vertical elevators which are right beside one another in the Chozo ruins, but are many rooms apart in Tallon Overworld. There's a missile expansion among the venom weeds on the way out. If I had more time, I would like to do a run of the game where we only grab the items immediately in front of us. checking out what the developers intended as the minimum base experience for how much missiles and energy tanks a player would have, and how they tuned the difficulty around that. Unfortunately, that's too big of an undertaking for me right now. Reaching the frigate crash site, we're faced with a cliff that, once we drop from, we won't be able to go back up. Given that, after dropping down, we are faced with another wide door, you could be fooled into thinking, hey, I must be on the right track. This part is honestly my least favorite in the entire game. The level design clearly leads you inside the sunken frigate, lets you make good progress inside it, even lets you save the game, only to then drop a dead end. That's already a bad time in and of itself, but it gets much worse when you take into account a good portion of this place is, as the name implies, underwater. This hinders Samus's movement, making traversal a real slog. And that's not even all. The way back is a huge platforming section, probably the biggest in the game. This means a single fuck up will send you plummeting down in slow motion, and getting back to where you were will be equally slow. This is the intended experience the developers wanted you to have. I feel pretty confident in saying this because of the trail of white doors that led us here, as well as the custom message that tells the player they can progress until they upgrade the Varia suit. To me, this message screams of a band-aid solution to the fact that players must have felt like this was the correct path, and if they couldn't climb the elevator shaft, then there has to be another way up, right? The game wouldn't make me crawl all the way here, only to send me back immediately, right? This scenario does make for a memorable obstacle, since it's not likely players will forget this frustrating mess. So right when they get the gravity suit, it's easy to know where to go next. I'm not against making the player move into an area where they will stumble into a dead end, but if you're not going to introduce anything on the way back, it needs to be a short path. There's absolutely no reason this dead end should be this deep into the frigate, near a save station that essentially locks you behind a frustrating platforming sequence. The only solace players might take from this is the energy tank right at the dead end. I think it's pretty likely players will see this hidden in plain sight as they search for their way up the elevator shaft before the message pops up to send them back. As we leave the frigate, it's time to look at the map to determine where to go next. We just came from the Chozo ruins, Tallon Overworld doesn't have any other wide doors, Magmoor Cavern and Phendrana Drifts seem like the best options. First one, there's the white door on one of the tips of Magmoor Caverns, but that leads us straight to another dead end with Bendesium rubble blocking our path. Thankfully, this is really close to the Phendrana Drifts elevator where a spider ball path and a wide door await us. We're finally back on track to make some progress. A new version of Phendrana's theme starts playing here. It maintains the soft piano of the shorelines, but it now sits on top of a completely different arrangement with electronic sounds. This theme is associated with the Phendrana Depths, a series of caves we're about to explore. It's a song with a fair amount of forward momentum, giving this sub-area a sense of exploration that's kind of the opposite of what you would expect from a series of damp, boring caves. But before that, we must cross the frozen spike. There are two paths available to us at the moment. One of them leads back to the thermal visor room, the second one leads to the frozen cave. There's a third door we can't reach yet, but we'll circle back to it in a bit. We can scan our first glider in this room. These creatures are basically moving grapple points, so there's nothing to do with them right now. Their scan log claims glider riding is a sport where a person will hook on to the creature using a grapple beam and see for how long they can hold on. It's probably one of the silliest bits of world building in the game. I can't decide if I think it's really dumb or if I love it. Since we can't partake at the moment, all we can do is drop a few stalactites using missiles to climb onwards to the next save station. The other door leads us to Phendrana's edge. We can't go up yet because we don't have the grapple beam, so all that's left to do is going down. We have to go underwater for a bit where we can find some gel zabs. We encountered these in the Sunken Frigate nonsense, but I was busy complaining about the section. These enemies open their mouths and draw the player towards their bodies, but that also exposes their weak spots. Fighting these guys boils down to a staring contest, waiting for them to expose themselves. Not a great enemy, to be honest. They are mostly interesting when combined with platforming segments for their ability to pull the player and mess up their jumps, but I think the reactor core platforming segment on the frigate is the only time that happens, and you already know how much I dislike that segment. The last thing it needed was more frustrating elements. The Hunter Cave is an oddly named place. It seems to suggest we would meet a Hunter Metroid here, a new breed for the series introduced in Prime, but that doesn't happen. A Hunter Metroid does spawn later in the game in the Frost Cave where we saw the glider earlier, even then only on some versions of the game. This room has some gel zaps and flicker bats. To move forward, we drop some more stalactites and there's only one door we can access. Diving into the waters, we reach the lower level of the gravity chamber. This room doesn't amount to much more than traversing a small underwater environment until you stumble upon the gravity suit. I think this section of Phendrana is a good example of using water to hamper the player's movement, only to make them appreciate the value of the gravity power-up. Something simpler like this is what I expected from the Sunken Frigate segment. Another enemy from that place appears here as well, the Aqua Reapers, but they're not really noteworthy at all. They function just like their ground counterparts. One environmental detail I like about this room is the cracked ground with light coming from below it. It seems to indicate that there's some geothermal activity beneath the Phendrana Drifts, which adds context to how we go from the lava world to the ice world in a simple elevator ride. It may seem gamey, and it kind of is, but at least there's this one room that kind of justifies it, I guess. With the gravity suit, it's time to go back to the Sunken Frigate. It's not very interesting backtracking since we were just there a few minutes ago and there are no new power-ups to acquire on the way back. Just adding insult to injury, really. Actually, there is one missile expansion we can grab on the crash site. There's a lake right in front of the frigate's entrance, and now that we have the gravity suit, we can jump to a higher ledge underwater to grab the power-up. Inside the frigate, as we make our way back to the elevator shaft, we meet a couple new enemies. The Tallon crabs, which are functionally very similar to the parasite swarms from the Orpheon and the scarabs from the ruins, and the Aqua Pirates, which are not too distinct from their flying counterparts. One aspect I neglected to mention on our first visit here is the beautiful music. It's such a soothing song that almost makes me forgive the design transgressions of this place. I think its tempo and cadence suits the rhythm of the particles and bubbles dancing underwater. Some of its sounds clearly evoke the idea of waves in my mind. It's an excellent piece of music overall. The reactor core had a cool wave beam plus thermal visor puzzle required to open the way forward. I solved it on my first visit, but these will be recurring on almost every room here. Functionally, they are not too different than scanning ruins in the Chozo ruins. They are exploration-based puzzles. But I like how they are contextualized as reactivating broken pieces of machinery. The downside to the invisible nature of the thermal panels is that more often than not, you will get to the end of the room only to find out the door is deactivated and have to go searching for the conduits hidden in the room you just went through. Some cases are worse than others. Unfortunately, the cargo lift is one of the bad examples because it involves platforming up the shaft twice, since one of the conduits is all the way down at the base of the room. The next room is an example of a less frustrating hunt for the conduits, since it's a much smaller place and the previous one already served as a reminder that most rooms in the frigate will have this sort of puzzle. If you're paying attention to the footage, it may not seem like it, but I actually just screwed up my 100% run. I killed the drones without scanning them, and while they may seem like the exact same enemy as a sentry drone, they are actually aqua drones. I'm conflicted on whether tying scans to 100% completion was a good idea. On one hand, it can be really annoying having to scan everything if you're trying to play the game in the same style as older 2D Metroid games, where the focus is on grabbing items only. On the other hand, Metroid Prime is a slower paced game. There's no bonus for speedrunning, and there is no glitchless sequence breaks like Super Metroid had. Scans feel appropriate with the game's more deliberate pacing. Ideally, I would tie items and scans to different completion metrics. Maybe you only unlock hard mode if you 100% items, while you only get the secret cliffhanger ending if you scan everything. A gameplay reward for gameplay completion and a story reward for story completion. Feels like an adequate solution to me. Anyway, since I'm going for 100%, I decided to kill Samus off so we can see what a game over looks like. I have to say, this game over screen was the scariest thing to me when I was younger. I think it's a combination of Samus's scream followed by the sound of a heartbeat flatlining over the image of her broken visor that must have struck me as a little too real in my 80-year-old mind. Nowadays, I really like this game over screen. It's a memorable part of the game for me, even if I don't see it too often on account of being super epic and stuff. When we hit continue, we are sent back to the last save station we used. It's typical behavior for a Metroidvania, especially at the time, when autosaving wasn't as prevalent in any kind of game. Losing minutes or even hours of progress by being sent back like this can be a very frustrating experience, but it can be used to create intense situations based on the placement of the save stations. But that's something I'll talk about more a little later. Back in the biohazard containment room, we can finally scan the aqua drones. I don't get why their description says they are weak to the wave beam when the ice beam pretty much annihilates them, but whatever. There's nothing of note about this variation other than how it doesn't respawn anywhere and can easily ruin your 100% run if you're not careful. My biggest issue with the Aqua Drone is just how similar it looks to its land counterpart. In general, I think it's good that the game has variants for its underwater enemies. Aqua Pirates, Talon Crabs, and Aqua Sacs are all creatures with identical land counterparts, but they all look at least a little different. Anyways, from here we keep moving in a linear path until we hit an underwater morph ball maze. The biggest difference from any other morph ball environment are the water currents pushing us up that can propel our bomb jumps much higher than regularly. In this room, it's used to hide an energy tank at a tall point that requires multiple sequential bomb jumps, more so than you would be able to pull off in a land environment. It's a cool little trick. Past this room, we have circled back to the bottom of the Great Tree Hall, where an ice beam door will lead us to the game's next area. But before that, I will open up the gate that separates the two halves of this room. This will help in navigation later, and I think it's a bit dangerous that the spinner device that handles the gate is further up than the door that leads to the path forward. It's not hard to imagine a scenario where a player has to go through the entire sunken frigate again simply because they didn't open the gate when they first visited this bottom half of the room. After opening it, we are good to keep moving forward past that white door. Immediately, the blue substance and red text jump at the player. This is the biggest amount of Phazon we've seen yet, but it's only a small taste of the game's final area, the Phazon Mines. With this place uncovered, all major locations of the game have been introduced, so I want to take a moment to talk about the game's overall structure. A criticism I've seen leveled at Metroid Prime is how gamey and paint-by-numbers its world can feel. The progression from forest to arid ruins to lava-filled caverns to a frozen mountain peak to evil factory wouldn't be out of place in a Mario game. I mentioned earlier how Prime borrows a lot of its structure from Super Metroid, and a lot of this gamey approach to area theming seems to be a direct result from taking a lot of inspiration from a 1994 game. The Orphean Frigate is a repeat of the Ceres station in Super Metroid, Tallon Overworld is a repeat of Criteria, Magmoor Caverns is a repeat of Norfair, and finally the wrecked ship in Tallon Overworld is a combination of the wrecked ship from Super with maybe a little bit of Meridia thrown in there for good measure. That said, Chozo Ruins, Phendrana Drifts, and Phazon Mines are all original ideas, and thankfully they are also the most intricate areas as well. It's curious then that this feeling of familiarity is so prevalent, because almost half of Prime's levels are not actually retreads of the ones in Super. I think for the most part the game does a decent job of justifying all the radically different environments being only an elevator ride from each other. Most areas are connected by the Magmoor Caverns. Taking an elevator from a lava area to an ice area seems nonsensical until you realize Magmoor Caverns are underground where geothermal activity flows, while Phendrana is atop a mountain, meaning the snow is likely a result of high altitude. I think the areas that make the least sense in their connection are Tallon Overworld and the Chozo Ruins. There's no reason why a short elevator ride from a rainy forest would lead to the dusty, arid-looking main plaza section of the Chozo Ruins. What's even weirder is that the ruins themselves are not entirely themed like that. There's plenty of rooms with vegetation and water going around. I think this transition from Overworld to Ruins could have been more gradual, similar to the first transition from the Ruins to the Caverns after the Flagra fight. This discussion is important to pinpoint one of the most beloved aspects of Metroid Prime, its immersiveness. A lot of things were lost or downgraded in Metroid's transition to 3D. The game is slower and there are no sequence-breaking tricks at the player's disposal. It's a much more linear experience. Prime makes up for its simpler gameplay with the most believable world the series had up until that point. They nailed the atmosphere so hard that most fans didn't seem to miss what was lost from the 2D games. Not that those weren't incredibly valuable things, they absolutely were, and I would love to see at least some intentional sequence breaks being brought to the Prime games. What I mean to say is that Prime managed to cement itself as a part of the series while offering a pretty distinct experience. I guess that similar structure to Super Metroid really did help. If Prime 2 or 3 launched as Prime 1, maybe the departure would have been more greatly felt by the fanbase. I think it's an interesting thought experiment, but this is the game that we got, so let's get back to the moment-to-moment gameplay. The main quarry is a large area with plenty of pirates to fight, as well as a powered-up version of the turrets in the form of mega turrets. The theme for the Phazon Mines is a lot less pronounced than other areas, opting for an ambient beat that gives off a feeling of sneaking around at the enemy base. It's not super memorable, but it fits the mood. There's a save station that requires using the spider ball to be reached. I think this is meant to keep players from rushing past the many enemies here and going straight to the station. Otherwise, I have no idea why place this short spider track here. The placement of save points so far has been pretty generous, never too far from objectives as to not cause frustration on a player that potentially dies on their way to the next objective. If you die anywhere on the Chozo Ruins, you're never too far from a save point. The same is true for Phendrana Drifts. Tallon Overworld has Samus's ship right in the middle of it, which not only saves the game and recovers health, but also replenishes missiles. Magmoor Caverns isn't great in that regard, but it's mostly a transitional area. Its elevators usually land pretty close to a save station in another area. The road ahead in the Phazon Mines, however, is a linear romp through this massive underground pirate base. It's another infamous segment of the game because of how far away the next save point is from the one we're in right now. Let's keep that in mind for now and discuss this part as a whole when we reach the next save station. To get past the quarry, all we need to do is scan a couple of panels to put down the force field. Before doing that, there's a missile expansion we can grab here. To do that, we need to climb up the station and scan a panel that will move the crane into a more favorable position, allowing us to use the spider ball to reach the power-up. One of the panels tells us that the pirates have been rewarding the members of their ranks that have displayed beneficial Phazon mutations. We'll see what those look like in a bit. A cool recurring feature of this area is the ability to turn off the mega turrets without having to fight them. We saw this on the frigate tutorial, but it had been so long it's easy to forget. The next room brings back the shadow pirates on its first floor and introduces a new type of pirate on the second, the wave trooper. I think there's some missed opportunity here for the developers to actually drop one wave trooper in the middle of the shadow pirates. Since they force you to use the thermal visor, players wouldn't be able to understand why their attacks were bouncing off of one of the enemies. I'm not sure it would have been the most fair first encounter with a new enemy type, but it certainly would have made for a memorable little interaction. The game does something a little similar during the boss for this area, but we'll discuss it when we get there. The actual introduction of the wave troopers is a bit more ceremonious than most enemies. They get a short little cutscene to indicate their significance. Scanning them reveals that, as their name and coloring implies, they can only be affected by the wave beam. Immediately, players will likely realize power troopers and ice troopers will also show up pretty soon. I like the trooper enemies quite a bit. They are probably the most challenging common foes in the game. They stop players from over-reliance on the latest, strongest beam they've acquired, and when different types are grouped together, it can create some hectic battles. One pet peeve I have against these guys is their scan description. It says the pirates have reversed-engineered Samus's beams, but a flaw in the design makes them weak to the beam they use. That's complete nonsense. All of the troopers fire what looks like power beam projectiles, regardless of their weakness. I think they were trying to make these color-coded enemies a bit less gamey, a bit more grounded, but that explanation seems like the laziest solution they could have come up with. The room we fight these enemies in is called the Mine Security Station, and I think it's probably the first red door we see in the entire game, so players can also confidently guess there will be a fire weapon and fire trooper variants in the future. Although the Hall of the Elders probably gave that away earlier with its colored morph ball slots, now that I think about it. Regardless, we can't even reach the red door yet because it's locked behind a gate that can only be opened after we find a way to blow up Bendesium structures. This is a situation we'll stumble upon a couple more times here in the mines. In the Elite Research Room, we're immediately greeted with a giant Phazon-infused space pirate. You can scan its container to see it's made from Bendesium as well, so you can take a pretty good guess that you will eventually fight these things. Another interesting detail is that the tank labels it as an Elite Pirate Alpha. Couple that with the nearby pirate data log detailing the failures of the first few instances of Phazon infusion on pirates, this guy seems to be one of the few elites that survived without the vertigo strain of Phazon, which is what the log specifies as the more stable version of the poison which quote-unquote successfully mutated the parasites and the pirates. Moving up the platforms into a circular corridor gives us just enough time to see the cover barriers rise up as two wave troopers flank us from each side. I like this small scenario because of how it helps build the illusion of these enemies being smarter and more coordinated than the regular wildlife enemies of Tallon IV we've been mostly dealing with up until now. One more floor up, there's a cannon we can aim with a spinner device and fire using the scan visor. It's a bit cumbersome to use and you only get a missile expansion at the very last breakable wall, but for some reason I always find controlling these machines fairly enjoyable. Speaking of which, the next room has a massive ore processing tower with colored spider ball tracks attached to it. The player can rotate 3 different levels of the structure to form continuous paths that will allow them to climb up the room. It's probably one of the most complex morph ball puzzles in the game, but it's really not that complicated. If anything, the colored paths make it a bit too simple. Maybe if they only lit up with their respective color once the solution was found, it could have been more interesting. Players could puzzle out the solution or just brute force it until it lights up if they're not interested in puzzle solving. Regardless, it's a fairly memorable puzzle made a bit more interesting by the fact that we can't control the topmost layer yet, as it is covered by Bendesium debris. That means we'll have to come back later to reach the tallest point and solve the puzzle again in a different manner, which gets the most out of this simple setup. Taking the elevator down, we reach the second level of this area, which, as a whole, is easily the most vertical one in the game, fitting for an underground mining operation. The corridor here has a couple of shadow pirates waiting in the ceiling to ambush us, but blasting the crate with an orange dot on it explodes them before they even have a chance. And it grants us another missile expansion, which is always welcome. I find it kind of odd that neither these explosive crates nor the regular ones have any scans attached to them. It seems like the kind of thing you would want to have explained in the game's universe, but whatever. The next room is the Elite Control, and it has a ton of logs to be scanned and enemies to fight. One of the early panels tells us that the elite pirates have mounted plasma artillery cannons on their backs, and that the space pirates stole these from the Aegenoid Star Marines, another group that, much like the monks of Grondheim back on Magmoor Caverns, is only mentioned once and never again in the whole series. I kind of love these little world-building details. It's a bit like when you first hear about the Clone Wars in A New Hope. Just name-dropping something that sounds cool can send our imaginations flying, so it's cool to imagine all these factions acting in the background of the universe of Metroid. There are also a couple of pirate data logs right beside this panel. The first one tells of the pirates' ambitions to capture Semes in a way that would allow them to leverage her power suit for themselves. The other one tells us that at some point the space pirates had captured the creature from inside the meteor and dubbed it Metroid Prime. This is actually a big plot hole in the lore, since Metroid Prime was sealed within the impact crater, which the space pirates could not have accessed without the Chozo artifacts. Not only that, but none of the future pirate logs tells us how the creature escaped. This whole story has been rewritten in the PAL and Wii versions of the game. Now this log says the pirates have detected signs of a living creature behind the Chozo barrier, but they don't know what it is. Moving a bit further ahead, we get to fight a new enemy type, the Elite Pirate. Despite its intimidating size, I never had much trouble with these guys in comparison to the troopers. They are pretty slow and predictable, so the biggest obstacle is their ability to negate all attacks when their hands start glowing. But honestly, that only serves to prolong what would be a relatively straightforward fight. One cool feature that these guys have that I would have liked to see more of is a secondary lock-on target. You can actually aim at and take out the aforementioned artillery cannons on their backs before dealing with the enemy proper. After getting rid of the elite, more ice troopers are ready to come down on the player, which can feel a little relentless after fighting off a mini-boss in the same room. When the coast is finally cleared, there's still a ton of data to scan. One of the funniest logs is in this room, where the pirates recount their attempt to replicate not only Semes' beams, which resulted in the troopers, but also her morph ball ability, which apparently went pretty terribly for the subjects. To reach the door that will allow us to move forward, we need to deactivate a force field by scanning one of the red panels around it. Here, the game seems to hide the path forward among its lore as a way to incentivize players to engage with it. There are 5 other logs here. 3 of them deal with the pirates' relationship to the Chozo. They wonder how the Chozo artifacts can be used, seeking to learn what they can from the bird race before eliminating its remnants from the planet. The pirates act like they are only now discovering the Chozo, which can't be right because Semes also had Chozo stuff in it, so this might be another plot hole. The pirates say their ruins are ugly, which is kind of funny. They also report encounters with the Chozo ghosts. This tells us that the ghosts are indiscriminate in their attacks, since they also attacked us, which corroborates the Chozo records on their own deteriorating mental state caused by Phazon madness. The other 2 logs continue on the Metroid Prime capture plot hole. It says the creature broke free one day and assimilated a bunch of the pirate's tech into its carcass. It's an interesting way of explaining how Metroid Prime has similar color coding to the troopers, but it doesn't explain how the creature got out and then back inside the impact crater, so it's still a plot hole. Because in the end of these logs, the pirates do manage to recapture the creature. One of the optional scans here recounts several security issues caused by the frigate crash, which had to be handled before the pirates could focus on hunting Samus. So that is a neat explanation why we didn't see a bunch of them in the world at the beginning of the game. They were dealing with the frigate crash, but now they start popping up in places like Phendrana and Magmoor. With that, we are finally ready to leave this room and head to the ventilation shaft. This room is a large half-pipe that fills up with poison over time. There's a bendesium grate on the floor, but we can't do anything about it yet other than run away from this place. It makes for a memorable location for us to revisit when we get the power bombs later on. Next up is the Omega Research, where we have to fight a combination of power and wave troopers. There are also some elite pirates in stasis all around the room, including one whose container has tumbled over. This just screams future combat encounter to anyone paying attention. On the top level, yet another bendesium debris blocks the way, so the only path available is the bottom one. The pirate log here tells us of the Omega Pirate, a creature that can heal itself in pools of Phazon and didn't suffer the mental degradation of the common pirate elites, allowing it to use a cloaking device. The pirates seem excited to use it as a standard unit of their army. It's a sinister prospect that, having fought the regular elites, an even more powerful version of that could be mass-produced, so it's up to Samus to put a stop to it. An optional scan here says Bombus are controlled by space pirates, which is something I never knew about. It makes me think of how these enemies invade the Ice Temple after we get the Wave Beam. It almost seems like a hostile expansion of space pirate territory in Phendrana while destroying the history of the Chozo people. We keep moving forward until we reach the Dynamo Room, where the weirdest mini-boss awaits us. It's an invisible drone that can't be locked onto, meaning we have to use precise aiming for the first and only time in the game. I like the game's commitment to making a unique combat encounter this late into it, but it's a very awkward fight if I'm being completely honest. What makes it especially egregious is its placement at the end of such a long stretch without a single save station. Also, because it is invisible, this drone is the only enemy we can't scan. If your health is already low, you might be spending precious time trying to figure out that you can't scan or lock onto this thing, running the risk of getting a game over and losing a good half hour of progress at least. After killing it, the rooms are unlocked and a save station is finally within reach. But before any of that, let us collect our reward for the mini-boss. Unlike most cases, it's not as simple as grabbing the power-up from the enemy's remains. This time we need to navigate an electric morph ball maze. It's not overly complicated, but again, there's a good chance you are low on health at this point if you don't know the save station is nearby, which can make balancing the morph ball not to hit the electric walls a nerve-wracking experience. Another thing I just discovered reading Zoid Kirsch's development stories is that the maze is procedurally generated. It is programmed to only produce mazes in which the player has to traverse at least 75% of its space before reaching the solution. Our reward is the Power Bomb, which makes the translation from Super Metroid practically unchanged. It's still a complete annihilator. Before saving, there's a cute optional panel we can scan to find out the space pirates have pets. Ground cats and Albaps. I really wanted to see what one of those looks like and how the pirates behave around them, but this is their only mention in the Metroid canon. Once again, this is the power of these tiny bits of world building. Finally, we save the game. Let's pause for a moment and recount just how much the game asks of the player in this segment. It introduces two of the most deadly types of enemies in the form of troopers and elites. We collected a missile expansion and scanned about 8 pieces of lore required for 100%. We went through one of the most complex morph ball puzzles, even if it's not super difficult, and escaped a poison chamber. We reached the final room to find a very unintuitive boss fight and an electric morph ball maze. At any point, all of this progress could have been lost. Despite having memories of dying on the maze, which is the most frustrating scenario imaginable, I do like this section. It is a prime example of the virtues of not having an autosave system. The intensity of diving deeper and deeper into enemy territory, being faced with a variety of new threats and puzzles, and not having a save station inside is exhilarating. Sure, it can be quite frustrating, it's a double-edged sword in that regard, but it makes for one of the most memorable segments in the game and one of the most enjoyables on repeat playthroughs precisely because of how challenging it is. The only thing I would change about it is having such a weird mini-boss. That feels a step too far into the meme design department. The power bomb finally allows us to break Bendesium materials, so there's plenty to do with it behind us, but for now, let's use it to move forward. The next corridor is a death trap with 3 mega turrets immediately pointing at the player. Fighting this number of turrets in such an enclosed space can eat up quite a bit of health, but if we keep our cool and inspect the room a bit more closely, we can use our morph ball to slip under the floor, reach the other side, and scan a panel to deactivate them without having to engage directly. In a game that's filled with corridors that act mostly as loading screens, this one stands out as particularly memorable. The next room has some optional panels to scan with a bit of world building that justify the giant mushrooms we are about to encounter. Apparently, the pirates use these as rations for their Phazon-infused experiments. Remember all the way back in Tallon Overworld when I pointed out some mushrooms on a cave? Those are called Saturnines, and these giant ones are the same ones but now infused with Phazon, growing so large that they now have become platforms. It's one demonstration of how the Great Poison has altered the biomes of Tallon IV. Another panel here speaks of the Phazon-infused creatures decreasing hostilities between one another. This seems to point to Phazon madness as more of a type of mind control, like the infested creatures start working in sort of a hive mind. I like the almost Lovecraftian aspect Phazon has in this game. This helps explain some of the events in Prime 3 as well, if I'm not mistaken, but that's a story for another day. The coolest thing about this room is the ability to turn off the force field containing the Metroids to unleash them on the unsuspecting space pirates. Of course, they'll come after you once they are done with their captors, but it feels so nice to be able to just sit back and watch 2 factions of our enemies kill each other for once. After the room is cleared of enemies, the path forward takes us to a field of the aforementioned radioactive mushrooms. The sound design here is cool, with the Geiger detector sounds being associated with radiation. Upon inspecting the Phazon hole in front of us, there's no way to get across at the moment. So it's time to go backwards and check all of those Bendesium structures we found along the way, now that we can get past them. Back in the Omega research room, the elite pirate in the damaged container wakes up and breaks free. This time around, I actually took the time to destroy its artillery cannon using the thermal visor. Like I said, I like that this is an option, but unfortunately these guys aren't that big of a challenge to justify the time commitment to taking out their cannons first before going for their bodies. On the upper floor, clearing the Bendesium rubble gives us access to the map station. The biggest info we get from this is how the mines are a mostly linear descent. Most of the rooms we didn't have access to on our first time through lead to single small rooms. Except for one, which to me seems like the logical path forward for a first-time player. As we'll see, the path forward is actually a little more ambiguous than it looks. Continuing backwards through the mines, we stumble upon the poisonous ventilation shaft once again. Now that we have the power bombs, we can drop one on the floor to reach the malfunctioning fan. Reactivating it pushes the puffers into the other side of the room, blowing up the metal grates and revealing another energy tank. Very nice. In the elite control room, I take the lower path I neglected earlier. There's Bendesium debris blocking the way, so we wouldn't have been able to do anything here up until now. This leads us to the Phazon Processing Center. This room is quite vertical and there are paths at its top and bottom. The bottom one is a red door covered in Phazon, so the upper path is our only option. We reach that by doing some morph ball shenanigans and some platforming. The consequence for falling off here is pretty severe, both in terms of damage from Phazon and time lost, because the climb back up can take a good minute. Past this room is an elevator back to the Magmoor Caverns. Since we're so close to the Phendrana Drifts elevator now, I decide to explore that for a quick second, only to realize I don't remember a single Bendasium structure we can leverage our new power bombs on. I think I said this earlier, but while the level of detail on the map system might not seem like much, it's super easy to identify rooms based on their shape alone. To be fair, maybe that's because of how many times I've played through this game in the past, but I genuinely think it's an excellent addition to the world navigation of Prime. Analyzing the map, there's a Bendasium rock near the top of the Great Tree Hall, so that's where we're going next. There are two elevators near that place, one from the Phazon Mines entrance and another from the Chozo ruins. I could also take an elevator directly from Magmoor Caverns to Tallon Overworld, but because I didn't want to go through the sunken frigate again, I decided to go through the Chozo ruins. This is probably the most roundabout way of doing things, but going all the way back up through the Phazon Mines felt like it would be too much backtracking. Unfortunately, that was exactly the right thing to do, as it would grant me the Grapple beam and leave me pretty close by to the Great Tree Hall elevator. So yeah, this time around my lack of memory got the better of me, and I took the longest possible way forward. I still managed to grab some cool stuff along the way, so it wasn't a total waste, but it was far from optimal. Making my way across the caverns, I stop at the short tunnel room to blow it up using a power bomb, again a very familiar setup to anyone who's played Super Metroid. The reward for this very simple puzzle is disproportionately cool. It's one of the missile combos. This time around, it's the Ice Spreader. It behaves similarly to the super missiles in that it's just a super powered version of the regular thing, but it costs 10 missiles instead of 5. It can freeze things that the regular Ice Beam can't, including the final boss. Next up, I decided to check out what's hidden below the room where we got the Chozo artifact, only to realize that I was out of power bombs. I even tried farming a bit, but ultimately I decided to leave it be for now. That's kind of a disappointing situation to be in. The challenge for this optional pickup is to remember a place where a power-up can be used hours after you first encountered it, and just by intentionally coming here, I succeeded at that part. So being denied the reward based on ammo count feels kind of bad. On the other hand, the power bomb is a very overpowered weapon that needs to have a hard limit on its use, otherwise it trivializes the game even more so than it already does at some points. It's a catch-22, but I think having a crate nearby that always drops a single power bomb if the player doesn't have any could easily solve the problem. That's obviously a nitpick, but it's interesting how many of these small tweaks can fly over developers' heads when they have to build such a large world. I don't think there's any way around that, and I certainly wouldn't call this a flaw in the overall game's design, but it is a little frustrating to be in this situation. These small instances can pile up on a less polished game, but thankfully I don't think anyone would say that's the case with Metroid Prime. Arriving at the Chozo ruins, I decided the shortest way to the elevator I need to get to Tallon Overworld is to go backwards through the tunnels leading up to the Flagra boss arena. This means climbing up the Sun Tower using the Spider Ball after locating 4 scannable runes at the base of the room. Upon reaching the arena, a group of Chozo ghosts lock up the doors and we are forced to fight them. As a reward for this, we are given the Artifact of Wild. I wasn't intentionally looking for it. As I said earlier, I'll leave the hunt for the artifacts to the endgame, but I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility that a first-time player will accidentally stumble upon this one, just like I did here. The clue to this artifact says we have to free the Chozo ghosts that have been drawn to Flagra's corruption. It makes sense that the ghosts would be here. As a big source of Tallon's water, it must have been considered a sacred place by the nature-loving Chozo. What's a little less clear is why these ghosts don't attack us on our first visit. I'm assuming they didn't attack Flagra because they are all under Phazon Madness, which operates under the hive mind I mentioned earlier, so I guess that's the best explanation we'll get here. Why, or even how the Chozo tied the artifact to these ghosts is an even more dubious matter, and any attempt to explain it would be mostly speculation. At moments like this, the lore kind of cracks a little and exposes the world's more gamey nature. The artifact is tied to these ghosts because the developers wanted to lock this progression item behind a challenge. Simple as that. At the Gathering Hall, we can grab a missile expansion I missed earlier, which was available as soon as we got the double jump. All that's necessary is using the red lights as stepping stones to reach the tallest spot possible. At the furnace, I stopped to try to figure out how to climb the spider tracks, but my memory and skills fail me. The solution, as we'll see later, is to powerbomb the floor, but I couldn't find the scan that indicates the floor is breakable here. This is one flaw of the system that was corrected in future installments. The scan icon is too small. It's the same reason I missed the Mecha Hive scan on my first attempt on this playthrough. Yeah, I actually had to do that fight twice. The solution the other games came up with was to shade the entire enemy or object with a primary color. I can't fault them for not getting it perfectly on the first try, especially since not many objects are large enough that the icon doesn't cover the entire thing, so it's kind of not a big deal in most cases. I did all this roundabout trip, failed to grab 2 of the power-ups I could have, but finally I reached the top of the Great Tree Hall, powerbombed the rock, missed another missile expansion on the half-pipe, and reached the X-ray visor. I like how, despite picking a weird route, there were still many secrets to find and I still ended up making progress. I'd go so far as to say that, despite how long this trip took, I think it's far more interesting than just climbing back up through the Phazon Mines as was probably intended, simply because there's more chance for the player to stumble upon optional items they haven't picked up yet. We can use the X-ray visor to discover that there's more room behind the walls here. Exploring the life grove, we can climb some trees to reach the top of the visor room and leave the place, but on the way there, another group of Chozo ghosts pop up. Thankfully, now that we have the X-ray visor, we can keep track of them when they become invisible, which massively reduces the annoyance these enemies present. Also, the fact that we can see them with X-ray is another indication of a poorly thought out scan log. I don't fully understand how X-ray works in real life. I think it's based on how dense objects are, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't peer into other dimensions. Anyway, it's not a big deal, but these small inconsistencies do add up over time. Back on the Great Tree Hall, we can finally access the door behind the titular tree by using the X-ray to uncover an invisible platform. I really like that the rain here allows a savvy player to pick up on this a bit earlier. The reward is a missile expansion. From here, a short trip to the elevator puts us back at the top of the Phazon Mines. I think a first-time player would immediately try to use the X-ray to cross the Phazon gap back at the bottom of this area, so that's where we're headed. Of course, we'll be stopping on the way to check those unvisited rooms we can see in our map. The first one is in the mine security station. At one end of the room, we can break a metal plate made of bendasium to scan a terminal that deactivates the force field, but since it's a red door, we still can't access this one. On the way to the next room, we reach the Phazon Elite, which we can fight now that we have the power bomb to break it free. This guy is not very different from the regular elites, except he doesn't have the cannon, and visually he's a bit more corrupted by the Phazon. The reward for killing it is the Artifact of Warrior. Like the artifact we got from the Chozo ghosts, this clue makes little sense. How could the Chozo know the pirates would place the artifact here, so they could write it on the totem we scanned? I'm sorry to nitpick this, but it is an excellent opportunity for world building that they missed. The artifact we found on Magmoor Caverns expanded the significance of the place to the Chozo. It was simple, but it sparks the imagination. I kind of hoped the other artifacts would have a similarly logical relationship to their placement. Back in the room with the colored spider ball tracks, the place is now crawling with Metroids, which makes me wonder if there's any connection between their appearance here and us having freed them way down in the Phazon Shrooms room. We can now clear the bendasium debris from the third level control and use it to reach the tallest room, which houses the grapple beam. With that, we are finally back to our full kit from the beginning of the game. As I said earlier, I think this is meant to be grabbed before the X-ray visor. Here's another doomsday scenario. The player didn't pay enough attention to the gap in the Phazon mushrooms that end. They backtrack all the way through the mines, they get the grapple beam, and come to the conclusion that they can use it to cross the Phazon gap. They go all the way back down, realize that they still can cross it, backtrack once again all the way up through the Phazon Mines, go to the Great Tree Hall to grab the X-ray visor, go all the way down once again, and finally cross the gap. This is an unacceptable amount of pointless backtrack. You could argue it's the player's fault for not paying enough attention and thinking that they could use the grapple beam to get past the dead end, but the punishment is way too harsh for a simple lapse in memory or attention. I think the only reason we don't see more people complain about this is because most first-time players play the game with the hint system turned on, since it's the default. But I would argue the game shouldn't rely on it as a crutch. Most of the time, the game's level design is excellent in subtly guiding the player to the next destination. I think it's fair to open the game up at this final stretch, but this dead end would be better placed anywhere other than at the very far end of probably the game's most linear level. And so down we go, to the Phazon filled gap that drove us all around the world of Tallon IV. We cross it using our new visor, even grab an optional missile expansion on the way forward. Looks like we're finally ready to explore the rest of the Phazon Mines. Then, we enter the very next room, and we're stuck again. We need the plasma beam to move forward. I want you to add this factor to my doomsday scenario from earlier. That means even more backtracking through the mines is in store. Thankfully, this time we won't need to go back all the way to the Tallon elevator, since our next item is in Magmoor Caverns, which are not as far away from the dead end. There are 3 rooms with grapple points that have become available to explore after we get the grapple beam. One is in Tallon Overworld, in the upper half of the Root Cave, but one look at the map will make it clear that the door at the top also requires the plasma beam, so that's not it. The other 2 are the Magma Pool in the Chozo Ruins and the Geothermal Core in Magmoor Caverns. The latter one is closer, so that's where we'd try first, and thankfully that's the right path forward. Arriving there, we use the grapple beam to reach one of the disc platforms, but after that, this room is much more focused on the morph ball. At first, we use the boost ball to raise the discs and move from platform to platform. Once we're near the top, the ceiling is raised, revealing a massive spider ball track platforming section all around the perimeter of this massive room. I love this room. I already talked a few times about how much I like operating machinery using Samus's abilities, even despite of how simple it actually is. Getting a surprise spider ball track maze on top of that is just everything I could hope for. Of course, it's not all great. Falling from this maze can be a pretty infuriating experience, and I feel like I didn't have the same fondness for this challenge on my first few playthroughs. If there was some way to restart from the beginning of the spider ball segment instead of having to climb up the discs all over again, that would have been perfect. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm happy with how complex this room gets. It also doesn't hurt that the reward for beating this challenge is the plasma beam, the best regular weapon in the game. It's strong, easy to use, and can burn up most enemies pretty quickly. Back on the mines, we can see something that we were most likely already anticipating. A plasma trooper. The funny thing about troopers is that the most challenging ones are the wave and power varieties because they are only vulnerable to our weaker beams. The plasma trooper is a bit of a cakewalk in comparison. The plasma beam is so powerful it also makes quick work of the mega turrets and even elite pirates. It's cool to see the new beam rolling over enemies, but unfortunately the road back to the red door dead end is pretty barren in terms of new things to find. It's just boring backtracking. Finally, past that dead-end combo, we arrive at the elevator that will get us down to the 3rd level of the mines. A cool feature of these elevators are the transparent windows that let us peek outside. We can see the artifact temple floating above the impact crater. The nice thing is that even when looking at the map, these rooms kind of line up, which is a very nice touch. I really wish the other areas in the game were more consistent like that, because moments like these always add a layer of realism to the world. It makes sense that the mines are so close to the place where the meteor fell after all. Moving forward, we finally encounter a Hunter Metroid. Unlike its regular counterpart, these enemies can hook the player from a distance thanks to a new siphon tentacle. The scan makes it unclear whether this is a regular maturing of a Metroid, which would contradict the evolution chain from Metroid 2, or if it's a result from Phazon mutations. Looking at the wiki for clarification, it seems the Metroids in Prime 1 were later retconned into being a different species called Tallon Metroids. So a Hunter Metroid is just the adolescent stage of this particular type of the creature. Of course, this contradicts the pirate logs, which state they were brought to Tallon IV by the pirates. But since they've been here for a few years, I guess they could have mutated into a separate breed of Metroid. I don't know. Other than that, there's nothing special about these guys. Since they don't stick to Samus's face, they're even a bit easier to deal with, actually. I mocked glider riding earlier, but as you can see, I haven't quite mastered the art form myself, so I was just jealous. This Morph Ball maze here, I think is the only time the game uses these vanishing platforms as an obstacle that requires the boost ball to be overcome, which feels like a bit of a missed opportunity. There's a path here full of Phazon which might get the player wondering how they would be able to cross it, hinting at the use of the Phazon suit later on. Some more glider riding gets us access to a missile station. Again, these are severely underutilized in Prime. It could work as an indication that a big battle is coming up, but the other time we've seen one of these, that wasn't the case. Still, replenishing missiles will be a big help for the battle ahead. On the next corridor, we are faced with some invisible bomb boosts. I think this is a cool little twist, and I kinda wish more enemies would have invisible variants like that. Immediately, the sound of the enemy is recognizable, but there's still a moment of confusion when you first see a bomb being dropped out of thin air, and suddenly it clicks that the enemy is invisible. It's good stuff. At Metroid Quarantine B, we need to dispatch a group of plasma troopers, cross a gap full of Phazon using the spider ball and the grapple beam, and deactivate a force field to then engage with another group of troopers. The terminals here tells us a bit more about the Omega Pirate. They have short lifespans and they're weak to missiles. It makes sense now why the game placed a missile station a few rooms back, not to mention the missile expansion hidden right beside the terminal inside a cordite tank, something that should be familiar to any player that grabbed the one in Phendrana Drifts, pretty much identical to this one. I think this one is meant to be a freebie to help on the coming fight. We also have a save station nearby, another indicator of a big fight coming up. Moving forward, we use the plasma beam to melt the ice obstructing the gate to the boss fight. A lone plasma trooper makes sure the player already has the proper beam selected, which I think is clever because it's the first time the player will be forced to use this weapon in that way. Having it selected already makes it easier to connect the dots. Like the wave beam with its electricity, the elemental properties of the plasma beam are used for minor puzzle solving. It makes me wonder why we didn't see a similar instance for the ice beam. It seems like a no-brainer, but maybe it was cut for time, who knows. Like we've been doing before each boss, it's time to discuss the road that led us here. This is where the game has gone almost completely hands-off. First, it expands on all previous visited areas, except maybe for Magmoor Caverns. But the Chozo ruins expands into its depths with the Hall of the Elders as a centerpiece. Tallon Overworld expands into the Sunken Frigate, and Phendrana Drifts expands into the caves where we get the gravity suit. After all that, we get a whole new area to explore in the Phazon Mines. This part of the game makes the world feel huge, and I particularly enjoy revisiting old areas to find they're much bigger than previously thought. Where this section kind of falls apart is in the backtracking department. The sunken ship and that Phazon gap at the bottom of the mines are pretty egregious if you ask me, and overall contribute to this being my least favorite part of the game. Yes, even the artifact hunt coming up next outranks it in my opinion. Not that there aren't good moments. Like I said, the first time diving into the Phazon Mines is one of my favorite moments in the game, but this is partially a result of being a long linear section, and I think this area would have actually really benefited from having more entry and exit points. The next room houses the fourth boss fight, the Omega Pirate. Visually, it's just a larger version of an elite pirate, which is already the largest common enemy in the game. Its behaviors are also quite similar with its ground pound shockwaves and its glowing beam defense. There are 4 weak spots in its body that can be aimed at, and the player must destroy all 4 before being able to deal damage to the creature. The problem is that when that happens, the Omega Pirate becomes invisible and summons a bunch of troopers to harass the player while it recovers its Phazon plating in one of the Phazon pools in the corners of the room. This means players have to deal with the troopers quickly, while listening carefully for a sound effect that indicates the Omega Pirate is vulnerable at one of these pools. At that point, it's time to unleash hell on the enemy before it recovers its 4 weak spots, and then the cycle begins again. I said earlier I would really like to see a mixture of a different visor with the color-coded trooper enemies, and that's exactly what we have here. If we activate the X-ray visor to look for the boss, we won't be able to tell what the color of the enemies attacking us are. But if we leave the regular visor on to deal with them, we won't be able to target the boss. It creates a pretty cool juggling act. The song for this battle has a lot of sustained harmonies, which gives it almost a chant-like quality, but with an obvious electronic aspect to it. It fits the grandiosity of the enemy as well as its artificial nature, as a freakish space pirate experiment. This boss is one of the most challenging ones if you try to play it straight, but it can be completely trivialized if you drop a power bomb to destroy its 4 weak spots and unleash a couple of super missiles while it's vulnerable. I like that there's a quick way to dispatch the enemy for speedrunners, but maybe it could have been something a little bit more involved than that. Our reward for defeating the Omega Pirate is the Phazon suit, which looks absolutely badass, especially when I was 8 years old. I think it's a bit silly the way Samus acquires it. The Omega Pirate crushes her, but instead of dealing damage, her suit just absorbs the Phazon and becomes resistant to it. I don't think this is ever properly explained, but it's possible that the sentience of Phazon recognized Samus as a stronger candidate than the Omega Pirate and decided to collaborate with our protagonist in order to go back to the source. If so, it kind of implies that the Omega Pirate is also a part of Dark Samus from the future games, but this is just my own interpretation. With the boss of this area dispatched, we can move forward and loop back to the Phazon Processing Center. Except, now that we are immune to the radiation, we can navigate its lower levels without any issues. The question now is, what should we do next? The game doesn't really indicate that our next objective is to collect the artifacts. I think it would have been a good approach to put one of the artifacts on the obvious path right after the Omega Pirate fight. This would act as a reminder that there are 12 of these things spread throughout the world and that maybe now it's time to start collecting them. If we needed to expand it to 13 artifacts, so be it. To be fair, a first-time player might think, what are some Phazon-covered places I can use my new suit on? And remember the Phazon mining tunnel with the morph ball maze containing a Phazon-filled path. If they investigate that, then they would stumble upon an artifact that would indicate the hunt is on. I think that would be a decent solution if the room was placed after the boss arena and not before it. As it is, it just goes against the instinct of most players to check what lies after a boss fight, not before it. Tallon Overworld has a grapple point and a red door that have been teasing us since the beginning of the game, so I came to the conclusion that it's a reasonable place for a first-time player to want to explore, so that's our next destination. Crossing the Magmoor Caverns with the grapple beam alleviates some of the repetitive nature of this place, but I think it comes way too late in the game, and the area itself could probably have been pushed further still in terms of shortcuts. While we're crossing this section, let's go check on that room hidden beneath the artifact room that I couldn't access earlier because I forgot to bring some power bombs. Doing so, we discovered a new type of optional power-up, the Power Bomb expansion, which increases our capacity by 1. There are 4 of these spread throughout the world, allowing for a total of 8 bombs to be used by the player. Arriving at the root cave, we must make use of the grapple beam, X-ray visor, and plasma beam to grab ourselves a couple of missile expansions. It's kind of funny how often these three particular items are used in quick succession. From this point, there's nothing I can think of to guide players to the Impact Crater, but hopefully they'll remember that place seemed important and go there check it out at some point. We're about to start another one of the game's most infamous segments, the Artifact Hunt. I'll reserve my full thoughts on it to the end, but I can say right now that I wholeheartedly disagree with the criticisms of this part, with the exception of one thing. Every time I replay this game, I'm always caught off guard by the fact that not all totems in the Artifact Temple are activated. Why in the ungodly hell did they do this? All it does is provoke more pointless backtracking than would be necessary otherwise. It taints what is, in my opinion, legitimately one of the most fluid parts of the game. But again, I'll explain myself better once we're done. Since we've already scanned all the available hints, it's all a matter of finding where each clue points to and trace a route to follow. My first instinct is to start with the artifact of Chozo since it points to the life growth in Tallon Overworld, which is where we are already. But I still haven't fully recovered from my hatred over the Sunken Frigate dead end, so I would rather get there by going through the Chozo ruins. While there, we can pick up the artifact of the Life Giver, which points to the Tower of Light, as well as the artifact of the world, which should be in the Hall of the Elders. From there, it's a quick elevator ride to the Life Grove. With the route set, it's time to head back to the Chozo ruins. The Tower of Light is the closest to the ruins entrance. All we have to do here is sink down to the bottom and use the wave beam to open the door. That means we could have gotten this one as soon as we got the gravity suit. It's marked on the map as an unvisited room, so it's easy to imagine just stumbling into it if you're a first-time player trying to find your next destination. This artifact is called the Life Giver. Given its location in the Tower of Light, I wonder if Life Giver is a reference to the sun. There are murals of the Tallon star in these very ruins, so it's clear the Chozo revered it to some extent. From here, we'll make our way to the Hall of the Elders, but first, let's swing by the magma pool. Now that we have the grapple beam, we'll finally be able to get across. On the other side, we can blow up the wall to grab a power bomb expansion and our final Chozo lore. This one tells of the Chozo mistakenly mixing visions of the future with visions of the past. They paint Samus as a symbol for hope, but also a menacing figure. To me, this seems to be foreshadowing Dark Samus. The secret ending of this game confirms that they were already thinking of taking the story in this direction, so I don't think it's a stretch at all. So much of the lore is confusing and nonsensical on this first release, but this is the one piece that actually hints at a grand plan for the trilogy. This could also be the reason why the mindless ghosts attack us. They can't distinguish between the current Samus and her future dark doppelganger. The next room is the training chamber, where we fight a couple of Chozo ghosts. Given that these enemies haunt sacred places to the Chozo, this room must have been important to them. Since this room is basically just a giant half-pipe, and we know the morph ball is Chozo tech, this is probably a place where they were trained to use it. Anyways, we swing around using the boost ball, travel through some spider ball rails, and grab ourselves another energy tank. From here we circle back to the main plaza by going through a morph ball maze with crushing pistons. From this new vantage point, we can grapple onto a grapple point and swing to the other side of the room to grab ourselves a missile expansion. This one has been teasing us since we first entered the Chozo ruins way back in the beginning of the game, so it's a good feeling to finally get it out of the way. Moving forward towards the Hall of the Elders, we take another detour at the Gathering Hall to reach the Watery Hall. Turns out there's a secret chamber underneath the water that we can get to now that we have the gravity suit. This place houses another missile expansion. When crossing through the furnace this time around, I do know what to do to get up to the spider tracks. Blowing up the ground reveals a half-pipe that we can use to boost ourselves up there. After that, it's all a matter of following the path, avoiding some parasites, and balancing the morph ball to reach another missile expansion. Finally, at the Hall of the Elders, we dispatch the Chozo ghosts once again. After the coast is clear, it's time to see what's behind the red morph ball slot. Turns out it's a secret room that leads us to the artifact of the world. This time around I don't have any theories on why it's called that or why it's hidden here. Next stop is the Life Grove. In the Life Grove tunnel, we can use the boost ball to grab a missile expansion I missed on my first time here. The hidden morph ball passage here just screams classic 2D Metroid to me, so while there's not much to this secret, I'm kind of fond of it. In the grove itself, we must drop a power bomb on a small body of water to make a pillar rise up with a spinner device attached to it. Using it reveals the artifact of Chozo. This is another one where I can't glean any kind of lore from. We still have 2 artifact clues to get through, both pointing to Phendrana Drifts, so it's time to build our route once again. The artifact of Elder points to Tower, which can only be the control tower in the Space Pirate base, while the artifact of Spirit literally says Phendrana's Edge, so that's where we'll find it. Phendrana is a bit hard to reach since we can only do it through Magmoor Caverns. The simplest route I could think of is to go back to the Chozo ruins, take the elevator back to Tallon Overworld to skip the sunken frigate, and from there we head to the Root Cave elevator to take us to Magmoor, and then we reach Phendrana. It's a little crazy that the Phendrana Drifts are so segregated from the rest of the world. I understand it's on a mountaintop, but maybe a transport from there to the Phazon Mines, combined with making all artifact clues available immediately, would not only help out tremendously, but also make quite a bit of sense lore-wise, considering these are the 2 Space Pirate bases on the planet. Maybe an elevator would be too far away, but maybe some kind of train, like the ones in Metroid Dread, could be cool. It's just wishful thinking, but I really think it could have helped both regions. When we finally reach the area in question, we are immediately treated to an easy energy tank to complete our collection. All we have to do is break the ice by shooting it with a plasma beam. At the Frost Cave, we can now ride that first glider we encountered earlier to reach a vantage point that will allow us to drop this stalactite and shatter the frozen layer of the lake below, granting us another missile expansion. From here, it's not long before we reach Phendrana's Edge. The artifact clue tells us the next piece is at the top, so that's where we'll head first. Once we're there, we can grab ourselves a power bomb expansion, but that's not really what we're looking for. Looking at the clue again, it clearly indicates the path is invisible, so it's time to pull up our X-ray visor. It takes a bit of looking around since the passage is not technically at the topmost platform, but actually a few platforms lower. After finding the entrance, we get the artifact of Spirit. Not much lore to discuss here, but I like how the artifact of Spirit requires making the invisible visible. It feels appropriate. Another nice touch is how the invisible door doesn't appear on the map. It's easy to imagine it as an oversight that would spoil the solution, but the team actually remembered to make it invisible. We go through the gravity chamber on our way to the control tower. At the ceiling, there are some ice stalactites we can melt using the plasma beam to grab yet another missile expansion. This is the only instance of ice stalactites like this in the game, and it kind of reminds me of the problem of looking up from the Portal commentary. Players will not always look up, so placing a hidden power-up on the ceiling is actually an interesting way of hiding something in plain sight. When we arrive at the control tower, dispatching the flying pirates here is pretty effortless with the plasma beam. After the coast is clear, the clue clearly states we need to knock down a tower. This is one of the most memorable artifacts to collect because you wouldn't imagine those towers off in the background are actually interactable, much less destructible. But it turns out you can climb behind one of the room's doors and destroy some crates to reveal a sort of window covered in ice. Melting that ice allows you to aim at some tanks on the tower's base. A single missile is enough to send the whole thing tumbling down, and the artifact of Elder is now ours. This artifact would probably make more sense in the Hall of the Elders, but clearly at this point I'm thinking about this way harder than the developers did. And that's all the clues we had access to last time we visited the impact crater, so that means it's time for more pointless backtracking. Again, I want to hammer home how nonsensical it is to lock some of these clues for later. It would have been much more enjoyable to plot out our routes with all information in hand. Since we need to backtrack, I decided to swing by the Thardas arena to check out this small morph ball tunnel we can see on our map. On the way, the plasma beam continues to be a beast, making quick work of the she-goths, which are now common enemies. The tunnel leads to the quarantine monitor, where we can grab a missile expansion and scan a panel that confirms that Stardust was part of an experiment on inanimate objects, which I wasn't super sure about up until now. There's quite a few power-ups we can grab before leaving Phendrana. We can melt an ice ceiling in the Ice Ruins West to grab a power bomb expansion, travel up some spider ball tracks and melt some more ice barriers to grab 2 missile expansions on Ice Ruins East, and repeating the spider ball track and ice barrier melting combo on the shorelines to grab yet another pair of missile expansions. With that, we found all optional collectibles in Phendrana Drifts. The only thing left to collect here is an artifact in the Chozo Ice Temple, literally 1 room away from where we are, but because I didn't have that clue yet, I couldn't know that unless I remembered the frozen statue atop the temple from hours ago. On the way back to the artifact temple, we can stop at the Triclops pit in the Caverns to grab another missile expansion. This one is one of the hardest power-ups to find on your own in the entire game, because it requires the use of the X-ray visor in a completely unassuming empty space. I think this could have been made more intuitive if the power-up wasn't covered up by a breakable wall, so players could see it in the distance and then figure out later how to grab it. But then again, fairness was never a requirement for hidden pickups in the 2D games, so this doesn't feel super out of place for the series. In a sense, I like that there's a puzzle that requires the X-ray visor in such an unassuming room, but I can only imagine how frustrating it could be for someone trying to 100% the game without looking up a guide. Arriving at the Artifact Temple, there are 3 new clues for us to scan. The clue for nature points to the lava lake in Magmoor Caverns. The clue for sun points to the aforementioned Chozo Ice Temple. And finally, the newborn clue points to the Phazon mining tunnel in the Phazon Mines. Instead of plotting the most logical path, I will do some power-up roundup while I hunt for the final 3 artifacts. If you read between the lines as I was describing the last missile expansion, you'll probably realize I'll be using a guide for these final pickups I missed. So let's go to the Chozo ruins first. Between the magma pool and the training room, there's a super well hidden morph ball tunnel on the training access corridor. It's behind a bush of red leaves and it leads to a missile expansion. It's probably the 3rd hardest pickup to find if you ask me. Right behind the one we just got on the Triclops pit and another similar one in the Phazon Mines, which we'll grab in a bit. Looping back once again to the main plaza, it turns out this tree houses a secret cordite branch which can be blown up using a super missile. It takes me quite a bit to figure out how to climb up to it though, which is embarrassing because I don't think this is even the first time I've ever gotten this power up, but it completely slipped my mind. With that, we're done with the ruins for good. Time to move to the caverns. At the lava lake, the artifact clue indicates our goal is inside a large pillar. The pillars are not scannable, but the X-ray visor makes the artifact of nature visible. A super missile blast is enough to blow it up and grant us another piece of this puzzle. I think it makes sense for this artifact of nature to be placed at the pulsating core of the planet, though that logic could apply to almost any other region outside of Phazon Mines really. Next stop is the Chozo Ice Ruins, where we melt the frozen water dripping from the statue's mouth to reveal a morph ball slot in its hands, opening the path to the artifact of sun. There's some sunlight shining through the ceiling, and the act of melting the ice itself relates to the idea of the sun, so I guess this artifact fits its placement well. With that, we are done with Phendrana Drifts as well. Our next stop is the Phazon Mines. In the Phazon Processing Center, there's another one of the really obscure missile expansions that require the X-ray visor. Like the Triclops pit, the very nature of these X-ray pickups makes them incredibly hard to predict, but it was at this point I noticed what was the major clue that the developers placed in these rooms for players to find them: the circular floating platforms. If memory serves me right, all the optional pickups that require the use of the visor are in rooms where some of these platforms are visible as an indicator that there are others hidden. That's true for the Triclops pit and right here at the Phazon Processing Center. It's a shame it took me a walkthrough to finally notice this. Maybe the designers put too much trust in the association between these elements, but it's very possible that I'm in the minority and things just never clicked for me. As you can see, that sort of thing can happen to even the most epic of gamers. Moving on to Fungal Hall B, we need to explore the Phazon Field floor to find a suspicious circle of small Saturnine mushrooms. If we lay a bomb here, we find ourselves another missile expansion. This one is pretty hard to find, but it's a classic video game trope to hide something in the middle of a suspicious circle, so I think it's fair game. It's like seeing a waterfall, you just know you have to check if there's something behind it. Finally, we reach the Phazon mining tunnel to grab the very last artifact. It's the artifact of Newborn, but since it's one of the ones captured by the pirates, its name has no relevance to its location. I'm just left wondering how the pirates got it to this place if the morph ball program never succeeded. Maybe it wasn't captured at all, maybe it was just hidden underneath the earth and they dug it up by accident while mining Phazon. But I digress. With that, we now have all the required items to go to the game's final stretch. I'll give my thoughts on the hunt as a whole after we're done collecting the remaining optional items here at the mines. At the Fungal Hall access, we can drop below the giant mushroom to grab a missile expansion. I think we could have done this before by just tanking the damage, but grabbing it with the Phazon suit is the most appropriate way to do it. As we climb up through the mines, we reach the security station and we can finally open that red door. The reward is the final missile combo, the flamethrower. It behaves as you would expect from its name, draining missiles every second it's turned on like the Wave Buster. Overall, I find it a bit disappointing that the ice and plasma missile combos aren't hidden behind more involved puzzles like the Wave Buster at the Tower of Light. I feel like the coolest rewards should be a little harder to get, but the flamethrower is in a room obviously marked as unvisited. Any thorough enough player should stumble upon it even on their first playthrough. Regardless, just the fact these items exist as optional goodies is a big win for the game if you ask me. At Security Access A, we'll find the very last power-up, an optional missile expansion behind a wall of Bendazium. We get a nice message making it clear we got 100% of the items, which is very reassuring since this wasn't a thing in previous games. It wasn't uncommon to miss a single power-up and only find that out at the credits. So let's talk about the artifact hunt. I said before that I like it quite a bit. For a game where the main challenge is navigation through an interconnected world, having a final challenge that tests the player's familiarity with said world seems like an excellent idea. Up until the hunt began, the game loop consisted of grabbing a new power-up, remembering places you visited where that power-up would be useful, and charting a route to that place to test it out. The artifact clue essentially asks the player to focus on that last step, the routing, but with multiple points of interest to take into account. I think it's fair to complain about the hunt if this is not a part of the gameplay loop that you particularly enjoy. Part of the fun of the loop is also the anticipation of what new abilities and locations you're about to discover, and the artifact hunt doesn't really provide that feeling. Except for the fact that there are many optional items to grab when you reach that point in the game, even for somebody who's been playing the game like I have, grabbing most power-ups as they become attainable. This is a factor that mitigates the issue of not obtaining new abilities, but to what extent it succeeds is mostly a matter of opinion and preference. As long as we're talking about routing and mastering world navigation, it's important to discuss how that world is laid out, especially now that we have a clear view of the entire thing. Tallon Overworld might have Overworld in its name, but the true hub of Tallon IV are the Magmoor Caverns. And as such, it kind of baffles me that it is designed as a mostly straight line. This is an issue shared with the Phazon Mines. Both areas are far too linear, leading to an enormous amount of backtracking. Magmoor tries to solve this by making traversal slightly easier with each upgrade. Double jumping and the grapple beam can shorten the effort it takes to travel from one end to another, but there aren't nearly enough time savers like these to salvage this place. Its only saving grace is that you're rarely required to go from the Chozo Ruins elevator at one end all the way to the Phazon Mines elevator at the other end. The Mines' problems with linearity is that it only has 2 exit points at opposite ends of a very large road. Looking at this map from a top-down perspective, it doesn't seem to be too bad, but the level of verticality here is what causes a big issue. If you're at the bottom of the mines after the Omega Pirate fight and you want to grab an artifact at the Chozo Ruins, you either have to climb the entire mines, then go to Tallon Overworld and then to the Chozo Ruins, or you have to cross the entirety of the Magmoor Caverns for the 1000th time to reach the ruins. Both are pretty long routes. Now I want to stress that it's a lot easier to spot these faults than it is to point out the virtues of the map design. So I want to try to praise some of these smart decisions here. First of all, on an area per area basis, they are all quite well designed, except maybe for Magmoor Caverns. The first visit to the Chozo Ruins in the early game is incredibly tight in its design, with many areas that loop back to central hubs, making for effortless navigation even at later revisits. By the time we get to explore this area further after we obtain the Spider Ball, it's incredible how much of a different atmosphere the place can take, especially when ghosts of the past start popping up. Phendrana is excellent for a similar reason. Its early rooms have a beautiful, soothing atmosphere even when facing enemies that are a lot more aggressive than anything up until that point. It contrasts heavily with the oppressive and closed Space Pirate base. The first time through this section is a cool linear assault on the base, but it does suffer a little from the same problem the Phazon Mines do. Too linear, only one exit at each end of the line. However, Phendrana isn't even done yet because there's a third part to this place with a different atmospheric tone than the other two. The Phendrana depths are cavernous, but the music is a more upbeat version of the earlier sections, which kind of drive the exploration of these caves to feel more adventurous than isolated, cold, and wet like one would expect. The Chozo Ruins and the Phendrana Drifts are at the top of my list for favorite areas in the game, because each revisit seems to uncover newer depths to each one. But all areas work incredibly well, especially on a first visit. The transition from the ruins to the lava caves of the Magmoor Caverns is excellently paced. The first assault on the Phazon Mines is a memorable ordeal where the game just keeps throwing new things at the player constantly in a setting where the safety of save stations is long behind us. And while I curse the first visit through the sunken ship, even I can't deny the beautiful atmosphere on display. It may seem like I'm saying that the individual areas are great, but they are poorly connected together. And to some extent that's true. But the world design is what dictates the pacing of the game. If the first visit through these places is so memorable, that's because the world design worked in favor of presenting them with a proper pacing. And that's much harder to articulate by just looking at a map like I did when I was pointing out flaws. Since we're doing this recap of the game's world before the final area, let's do the same for the game's story. I already pointed out many of the inconsistencies and problems the original NTSC version of Prime presented with its lore, so I'll be using the PAL version of the game, which is much closer to all later re-releases, to try to convey the story's themes and meaning. The newer version of the Chozo logs talk less about their esoteric drifting between dimensions and makes things a bit less weird. They still have some visions of the future, but they are murky. The Chozo ghosts have been retconned into a sort of trial for Samus. They have no longer gone mad from Phazon's influence. Their will still persists, and they attack Samus because that will is the will to protect their planet and the places that are sacred to them. But the will alone is irrational, so they can't distinguish her as an ally. Another big change is that the Chozo of Tallon IV no longer recognize Samus in their visions. That makes sense because they probably never met her, but it's a little sad that we lost the Dark Samus foreshadowing in that final log, where the Chozo used to describe her as a menacing figure and a symbol of hope at the same time. The story remains a simple tale of a group of bird people living in harmony with nature in Tallon IV, until a radioactive substance came from the skies and started mutating the planet. The Chozo contained it using the artifact temple, but eventually ascended beyond the physical realm. Their will remains as ghosts in their sacred sites, but the poison keeps spreading even while its source is imprisoned. The space pirates arrive sometime later. The main difference in the PAL logs is that they never capture Metroid Prime. That's a good fix because it never made any sense. The pirates never managed to break the Chozo seal, so how would they have found Metroid Prime in the first place? We do lose an explanation for the final boss's color-coded design and artillery, but honestly, I'm pretty okay with that. One bad decision I have to call out is having the pirate data not organized by date in the pause menu. Like, good lord, why would you ever make it like that? It's such a chore to read them all in chronological order that any sane person immediately gives up or resorts to the wiki. Anyways, their story is basically about them reeling from their defeat in Zebes at the hands of Samus, and subsequently establishing new operations in Tallon IV after discovering Phazon from its immense energy readings. They go back to Zebes to recover some Metroids and Ridley's body, then they start experimenting with Phazon to create super soldiers among their ranks. They want to access the impact crater to harness even more Phazon at the source, but the Chozo artifacts prevent them from doing so. The game basically establishes these two cultures as foils to each other. One wants harmony with nature and tries to combat the energy that upsets the balance of the planet. Meanwhile, the other wants to harness that energy. They embrace the unnatural mutations at the expense of some of their own people. As a matter of fact, they constantly subject themselves to experiments even before coming into contact with Phazon. The space pirates want to evolve to become the dominant species of the galaxy, but the Chozo logs tell us that true knowledge and power can be attained through peaceful coexistence with the planet. I think this theme is particularly powerful in a game like Prime, where getting to know the game world inside and out literally makes you more powerful. This kind of resonance between story and gameplay is something I love about video games, and it is what my channel is all about. If I want to go really pretentious on this, I could even point out how the most linear segments of the game are the space pirate bases. These environments could almost be a physical manifestation of the stubborn single-mindedness of the species. Meanwhile, the rest of Tallon IV and the Chozo structures are laid out in a way that's a lot more organic, letting you wander about and familiarize yourself with multiple routes at any given place. Magmoor Caverns kind of throws a wrench into that interpretation a bit, since it's super linear, but these are just some interesting musings on how the game world was conceived. I can't ever know if any of that was actually intentional. Unless someone at Retro wants to clarify that, which I would be very excited to talk about. Anyways, I've rambled on for too long about the world. It's time to open up the impact crater. Except there's still one loose end that needs tying up. Just as we're about to use the artifacts to venture into the source of Phazon, Meta Ridley shows up and destroys the cipher. I don't fully understand his motivations here. As a space pirate general, you would think that he would want the path to the source of Phazon to be opened, but I guess maybe revenge could have blinded him? Ridley does seem to take on much more of the role of a bioweapon than a high-ranking pirate official in the Prime games. The fight itself was surprisingly uninteresting, at least a lot less interesting than I remembered. There's a lot of waiting around for his first phase. I guess that's a consequence of having a flying enemy in an open arena that needs to behave somewhat realistically. There's no reason for Ridley to put himself at risk if he can just drop some bombs and fly away most of the time. But it doesn't make for a very compelling fight. The remix of the boss theme from Super Metroid is excellent here, as we've come to expect from the Prime OST. So at least there's some good music playing while you wait for Ridley to do its song and dance. Thankfully, the second phase is a lot more involved. It requires mastery of dodging and good timing to hit the enemy's mouth in very short opening windows. We've sure come a long way from the stationary bosses of the early game. As Ridley is about to die, the temple comes alive to deal the final blow. It seems to be a consequence of the lingering will of the Chozo. I guess this could be seen as a moment of clarity in their weird instincts-based ghostly existence. Or maybe these particular ghosts were sealed within the artifact so they maintained some of their sentience? I don't know, but regardless of what it means, they open the way to the impact crater and the final fight is finally within reach. I like the visuals of the impact crater. It's more organic than you would expect from a flying rock, and the orange Phazon with only hints of blue create a really unnatural look with its contrasting colors. The further inside we go, the more orange prevails over the blue, which I think is a bit of a shame. I really like the look of this early pool of Phazon. It's also strange that Metroid Prime itself is blue, and later games never revisited the orange Phazon. A lot of the atmosphere here is driven by the quote-unquote music. It's not melodic at all. The weird noises could easily be thought of as diegetic sounds of the Phazon bubbling up. There are doors and a save station here, which can only mean the Chozo did explorations into this place. Either that, or the game didn't think hard enough to make a new door type for this area, which seems more likely. Here I am, complaining about the door variety yet again after all we've been through. What a journey. The Lumigek are another swarm type of enemies. It's funny that their description says they are native to Tallon IV, but we don't see them anywhere else. The orange Phazon is so much stronger than its blue variant that even our Phazon suit is not enough to shield us from the damage. So it's kind of crazy that this random lizard is able to absorb it without any issues, but nature can be crazy like that, I guess. In the next room we'll encounter another one of the most annoying enemies in the game, the Fission Metroids. These guys are color-coded just like the Pirate Troopers, so that means they behave just like regular Metroids, but you can't freeze them unless they are colored white. Not only that, but they can also go through some sort of mitosis and split into two different colored versions of themselves. By itself, it's a pretty cool idea for a late game enemy, testing our abilities with beam switching and dodging multiple enemies that can block our vision. The problem is the arena they are placed in. This room requires some massive jumps, and these guys can easily overwhelm us and knock us all the way down to the bottom of the room, which is filled with orange Phazon. What ends up happening is that it's just not worth it to engage with them in direct combat. It's better to run past them, and if they ever grab Samus's face, just drop a power bomb to clear all the enemies in the immediate surroundings. There's even a missile station to replenish your stock before the final battle. The next room is a simple corridor with spider ball tracks surrounding its walls. The slower movement speed of the morph ball on these tracks helps build anticipation, because the next room is the lair of Metroid Prime. And I have to say, I love this fight. I love how the fight continuously escalates. It begins with one beam weakness at a time, each one with its own set of attacks, and Metroid Prime in a mostly stationary position. By the end, the creature is shifting between weaknesses randomly, mixing attacks it only used in one form with other forms, and rushing the player from side to side. I love that its weak spot is so small that it requires you to be familiar with how each beam travels through the air once it's fired. For example, you can't just spam Ice Beam Blasts constantly, because its slower travel speed means that the monster's weak spot might have already moved by the time your attack makes contact. I love that this fight requires use of the Morph Ball and Boost Ball to dodge its rush attack. Successfully pulling it off, then turning back into Samus always puts her facing back towards the enemy. It shows the developers were paying close attention to how this battle felt, and programmed this little quality of life feature to make it as smooth as possible. It's a simple addition, but it always feels great to pull off. As an experiment, I played through this fight a second time because I was curious to see if spamming missile combos with a full arsenal would trivialize the challenge. But while I wasn't playing optimally, I was happy to discover that I ran out of missiles a bit before the boss's health had depleted entirely. So I still had to engage with a bit of its mechanics before being done with the encounter. All of that would have already been enough to make it a great final boss, but the game goes one step further with a second phase. The fight against the core of Metroid Prime isn't nearly as mechanically demanding, but it's still a great way to close things off. First and foremost, like the first phase focused on switching between beams, this one focuses on switching visors. It kind of makes no sense to me how this creature is becoming invisible to these different spectrums on the fly, but it's just video game logic at this point. Like I said, this phase is comparatively easier than the first, but the music helps in elevating the energy to make the fight feel like a proper final showdown. The track incorporates the Metroid leitmotif and is significantly faster paced than most songs on the OST. As the fight goes on, Metroid Prime goes from spawning regular Metroids to Hunter Metroids to Fission Metroids, and whenever it does so, a pool of Phazon is left behind. The game takes one less cue from Super Metroid with an invincible final boss that can only be damaged with a new kind of beam. In Super, the Hyper Beam was granted to Samus by the baby Metroid. In Prime, Samus must stand on the Phazon pool to activate the Phazon Beam. Interestingly, this beam is added to Samus's arsenal as soon as we get the Phazon suit, but it needs to harness the raw energy produced by Metroid Prime to be activated. Samus's notes are very rarely used for anything interesting, so I didn't even know about this until making this video. I really like that this fight combines a test of skill with more of a spectacle fight where the player gets a cool new superpower to lay down some satisfying punishment. It's the perfect way to end the game. As the boss's health reaches zero, the core is overloaded with Phazon and enters a weird brain-like state. It tries to grab Samus as it's about to blow, but only manages to get her Phazon suit. The way I see it, this act could have either been an intentional attempt by Metroid Prime to self-destruct and take Samus down with it, or it could have been an involuntary reaction to being overloaded with Phazon. It began grabbing everything around it that contained the substance in a sort of chain reaction before it exploded. Regardless of what the real explanation is, the impact crater begins to collapse. It's a perfect setup for a traditional escape sequence, but weirdly enough, the game doesn't go for it. Samus escapes in a cutscene, calls for her ship, and watches solemnly as the artifact temple burns down. It's a bittersweet ending in a sense. The threat is destroyed, but not before it caused irreparable damage to the planet and the Chozo. The burning temple is a testament to the Chozo's sense of duty to protect Tallon IV, even if it meant their own demise. If you grab less than 75% of the items, you see Samus take off her helmet from a distance, and the ending is cut short. More than that, and you get a good look at her face and see her flying off into space. I'm glad this game didn't go for a shot of Samus in a bikini suit as a reward. The reward for 100% is actually a lot cooler. It's a cliffhanger showing a black hand with an eye emerging from the remnants of Metroid Prime. We would come to know this creature as Dark Samus, but that's a story for another day. And that's a wrap for Metroid Prime 1. If I had to summarize my feelings on it after this analytical playthrough, I would say it's a game with many small flaws, dwarfed by its achievements. The level of quality Retro Studios achieved on its debut game is ridiculous and forever cemented them as one of my favorite developers, if not my favorite, period. Even after 10 years without a new release, I cannot wait to see whatever they cook up next. If the recent release of Prime Remastered is any indication, we're in for something special. Next time, we'll be looking at the darkest chapter in the Prime saga, Metroid Prime 2 Echoes. I hope you join me then. Subscribe so you get notified when that video is up, and if you want to help out the channel, don't forget to wishlist Tyrant's Twilight on Steam using the link below. Thanks for watching, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.